They called him the gentleman who helped women home after dark, until 5 families went to sleep behind locked doors, never knowing the monster was already inside, wearing the smile of a trusted friend. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker and truth cuts colder than fiction. I'm so glad you're here. Wherever you're watching from, you're part of the family. If you enjoy the stories, a like, comment, or subscribe helps keep the truth alive. Have you subscribed yet? I'll wait. Done? Perfect. Thank you. Now, this is the story of the Silk Strangler, when Bangkok's nightmares wore a human face. You think predators hunt in shadows, lurking in alleyways and abandoned places where screams dissolve into silence. But what if the most dangerous beast walks through your front door with a warm smile, speaks your language, shares your meals, and waits until your eyes close before revealing teeth sharp enough to tear through flesh and bone? Samkid Pumpuang didn't hide in darkness. He lived in plain sight, a chameleon among families, a wolf dressed in the wool of friendship and trust. Between 2005 and 2008, this man transformed ordinary homes into slaughterhouses, turning bedrooms into morgues and living rooms into crime scenes so savage that seasoned detectives vomited at the sight. 5 women, 5 families, 5 nights when trust opened the door and let hell walk through. This isn't just a story about murder. This is about the terrifying truth that sometimes the deadliest threat isn't the stranger outside your window, but the familiar face sitting across your dinner table, waiting for you to sleep. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. By early 2006, Samkid Pumpuang had transformed from opportunistic killer into something far more sinister, a serial predator with refined methodology and growing confidence. His 3rd victim was discovered on a February morning when Bangkok's famous humidity hadn't yet reached its daily peak. When the city still held on to the illusion of coolness from the night before, 35-year-old Wyman Salem worked as a street food vendor, famous in her neighborhood for pad thai that drew customers from blocks away. She was a widow. Her husband had died in a motorcycle accident 2 years prior, and she raised her 9-year-old son alone, waking at 4 a.m. to prepare ingredients, working her cart until midnight, collapsing into exhausted sleep before starting the cycle again. Her existence was pure survival, every baht carefully saved, every expense calculated. She lived in a small house in the Praet district, one of Bangkok's eastern suburbs where the urban sprawl gradually surrenders to warehouses and factories. Samkid had become one of her regular customers. He appeared 3 or 4 times weekly, always friendly, always ready with a joke or compliment. He learned her story gradually, feigning sympathy, positioning himself as someone who understood struggle. He never pushed boundaries, never made her uncomfortable. He was simply there, a constant presence that became familiar, then trusted. When he mentioned needing a place to stay for a few nights, a landlord dispute he claimed showing fabricated paperwork, she hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The extra rent money would help, and besides, she had known him for months. Her son liked him. He seemed safe. The murder happened on Wyman's one day off, a Tuesday when she allowed herself the luxury of sleeping past sunrise. Her son was at school. The house was quiet. Samkid struck in daylight this time, a variation that demonstrated his evolving confidence. He used a pillow first, pressing it over her face until panic woke her, until her hands clawed at his arms, until her legs kicked uselessly against mattress and air. But suffocation was too slow, too uncertain. He transitioned to his preferred method. Strangulation, using his bare hands this time, feeling her pulse flutter beneath his fingers like a trapped bird, feeling it slow, then stop. The sexual assault followed, then the stabbing. Multiple wounds to the torso, so many that investigators would struggle to count them, each one a punctuation mark in a sentence only Samkid understood. He left her displayed on the bed, arms positioned outward as if in offering or surrender. He showered in her bathroom, used her towel, ate food from her refrigerator. He walked out her front door in broad daylight, just another unremarkable man in a city of millions, and disappeared into Bangkok's endless labyrinth. Wyman's body was discovered by her sister that evening. The crime scene was, by now, familiar to a small group of detectives who had begun to notice patterns. Same victim profile. Working-class women living alone or with children. Same method. Strangulation combined with knife wounds. Same peculiarity. Children spared, valuables untouched. The investigators started using a term that made their superiors uncomfortable. Serial killer. Thailand had seen serial murderers before, COE in the 1950s, who cannibalized children. But that was ancient history, the stuff of legends and parental warnings. This was modern Bangkok, sophisticated, international. Serial killers happened in America, in the twisted pages of true crime books, not here in the land of smiles. Except they did happen here. They were happening right now, and the killer was accelerating. 3 months later, in May 2006, 30-year-old Ratana Suwin became victim number 4. Ratana worked as a seamstress in a garment factory, one of thousands of women who fed Bangkok's enormous textile industry. She lived in a ground-floor apartment in the Lat Freo district with her 6-year-old daughter. Her husband had abandoned them 2 years earlier, simply vanished one day, leaving no note, no explanation, no forwarding information. Ratana rebuilt her life through sheer will and 14-hour workdays. Her fingers perpetually pricked by needles, her back permanently bent from hunching over sewing machines. Somkid met her at a bus stop. The introduction was so mundane, so perfectly ordinary, that Ratana would later be unable to recall exact details to investigators. Except she never got the chance to tell investigators anything because Somkid made sure of that. He helped her carry bags when her hands were full. He rode the same bus route, creating the illusion of coincidence. He met her daughter, learned the child's favorite cartoon character, brought a small toy as a gift. When Somkid mentioned looking for a room to rent nearby, Ratana suggested he check with her landlord. He did better. He convinced her to let him stay in her living room temporarily, paying a modest amount that she desperately needed. For 1 week, Somkid played the role of ideal temporary tenant. He was quiet, clean, helpful with household tasks. He entertained Ratana's daughter while Ratana cooked dinner. He seemed almost part of the family, a benevolent presence that made life marginally easier. Ratana's natural caution, worn down by exhaustion and financial stress, dissolved completely. She stopped thinking of him as a stranger and started thinking of him as a friend, perhaps even something more given time. That reframing, that subtle shift from wariness to welcome, was exactly what Somkid needed. On a Friday night, after Ratana put her daughter to bed and retired to her own room, Somkid made his move. The attack followed his established pattern with metronomic precision. Strangulation, sexual assault, stabbing. But this time, something went wrong. Ratana's daughter woke up. The child appeared in the bedroom doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, not yet comprehending the horror sprawled across her mother's bed. She saw Somkid standing there, covered in blood, holding a knife. For several seconds, they stared at each other, the monster and the witness. Detectives would later speculate about what happened in that frozen moment. Somkid had never killed a child. His victims were always women. The children were always spared, always left sleeping through the carnage. Some psychological boundary existed in his twisted mind, some line he had not yet crossed. The little girl stared at him. He stared back. Then he did something that would prove to be his first significant mistake. He ran. He fled the apartment, leaving the child alive, leaving behind a witness who could describe him, leaving his carefully constructed pattern broken. The girl's screams brought neighbors running. Police arrived to find her catatonic with shock, unable to speak, but her presence at the scene changed everything. For the first time, investigators had someone who had seen the killer's face. Child psychologists were brought in, specialists trained to extract testimony from traumatized young minds. Took days, but eventually the girl provided descriptions. Height, build, age range. Nothing definitive enough for immediate identification, but enough to start building a profile, enough to give the investigation real direction for the first time. Bangkok police finally held a press conference acknowledging publicly what they had known privately for months. A serial killer was operating in the city. The The news exploded across Thai media. Television programs devoted hours to coverage. Newspapers ran front-page stories with lurid headlines. Radio hosts discussed safety measures. The phrase silk strangler emerged. Silk because of strangulation, because Bangkok was famous for its silk industry, because the word carried connotations of stealth and luxury twisted into something deadly. The name stuck. The publicity should have ended Somkid's killing spree. Any rational predator would have gone to ground, left Bangkok, changed patterns. But serial killers, by definition, are not rational. The compulsion that drives them operates outside normal risk-reward calculations. Somkid felt challenged rather than threatened by the media attention. He was famous now, even if no one knew his name. The fear spreading through working-class neighborhoods was his creation, his legacy. He had marked the city, and the city was marking him back with the sort of infamy that survives generations. He laid low for 4 months, but not because of fear. He was planning, selecting, preparing. August 2006 brought the rainy season in full force, turning Bangkok's streets into rivers, flooding ground-floor apartments, creating chaos that provided perfect cover for predatory movement. 29-year-old Somsri Kongchai lived in a small house in the Saphon Sung district, working as a convenience store clerk on night shifts. Her husband was a construction worker, his jobs taking him out of the city for weeks at a time. When Somkid met Somsri at her workplace, making small talk during slow overnight hours, he recognized the perfect setup. A woman alone most nights, tired from work, isolated in a house rather than an apartment building where screams might be heard. He courted her friendship with predatory patience. Night after night, he came into the store, buying small items, staying to chat. He learned her schedule, her husband's travel patterns, the nights when she was most vulnerable. When he finally appeared at her door claiming car trouble, asking to use her phone, she saw no reason to refuse. She knew him. He was harmless. He was safe. Somsri's murder was the most brutal yet. The autopsy report cataloged injuries so extensive that the medical examiner, a veteran of 20 years, requested psychological counseling after completing the examination. Somkid had spent hours with the body, inflicting wounds long after death, creating a tableau of destruction that spoke to accelerating psychological deterioration. The beast was no longer satisfied with killing. It needed to desecrate, to transform human being into abstract art composed of blood and trauma. Police found evidence at the scene that would eventually help identify Somkid. Fingerprints, biological material, fibers from clothing. But forensic science in 2006 Thailand was limited compared to Western counterparts. DNA databases were incomplete, fingerprint matching was manual and slow. The evidence existed but yielded no immediate answers. Meanwhile, Somkid was already hunting his next victim. By late 2006, Bangkok existed in a state of low-grade panic. The Silk Strangler had become the city's boogeyman, the subject of fearful conversations in markets and offices, the reason women double-checked locks and many refused to live alone. Police faced enormous pressure from media, from politicians, from a public demanding action. Task forces were formed, officers pulled from other divisions, rewards offered for information. But serial killers are notoriously difficult to catch precisely because they target strangers or casual acquaintances, leaving no obvious connection between murders, no trail of motive that investigators can follow. Detective Sergeant Thongchai Maha led the investigation, a 20-year police veteran whose hangdog expression and rumpled suits disguised a methodical, intelligent mind. Thongchai had worked hundreds of homicides, but nothing like this. He pinned photographs of the 5 victims to a wall in the investigation room, staring at them for hours, looking for connections beyond the obvious. All working-class women, all living alone or with children, all killed in their homes at night, all strangled and stabbed. The pattern was clear, but patterns alone don't catch killers. You need mistakes. You need witnesses. You need luck. Thongchai interviewed the surviving child witness multiple times, always gently, always with psychologists present. The girl's descriptions remained consistent. Medium height, medium build, average features, somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. It described approximately 2 million men in Bangkok. Thongchai distributed composite sketches to patrol officers, to neighborhood watches, to media outlets. Tips flooded in, hundreds of them, overwhelming the small task force, sending detectives on wild chases after false leads and mistaken identities. Meanwhile, Somkid continued his predatory circuit through Bangkok's working-class districts. He had not killed since August, his longest gap yet. The hiatus wasn't from fear, but from practical considerations. The intense police presence, the public awareness, the difficulty of establishing trust when potential victims were hyper-alert. He adapted. He moved to new neighborhoods where his face wasn't known. He grew his hair longer, added glasses, minor alterations that changed his appearance just enough. In November 2006, Somkid targeted 33-year-old Molly Presertt, a woman who worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in the Sukhumvit area. Molly lived in a tiny apartment in the Phra Kanong district, sending most of her salary home to aging parents in the north. She was deeply lonely, a condition Somkid recognized and exploited with surgical precision. He met her at a temple during a merit-making ceremony, positioning himself as a devout man seeking spiritual peace. They talked for hours that first meeting. He listened to her loneliness, validated her struggles, offered the companionship she desperately craved. Their relationship developed over weeks. Somkid moved slowly, understanding that the increased public awareness required more substantial trust building. He attended temple services with Molly. He walked her home from work. He met her for coffee and conversation. To any observer, they appeared to be developing a genuine connection, perhaps even romance. Molly certainly believed that. She told friends about the kind man she'd met, the one who actually listened, who made her feel valued. When Somkid asked if he could stay with her for a few days, a fabricated emergency involving sick relatives, she agreed without hesitation. This wasn't a stranger seeking shelter. This was someone she knew, someone she cared about, someone who had earned her trust through patient, methodical grooming. The murder occurred on a December night when Bangkok decorated itself for the king's birthday. Golden lights strung across every building, images of His Majesty displayed on every corner. Molly made dinner for Somkid, a special meal, the kind you prepare for someone important. They ate together. They watched television. The evening felt normal, domestic, safe. When Molly went to bed, she left her bedroom door unlocked. Why wouldn't she? She trusted him completely. Somkid waited until 3 a.m. He entered her room carrying a knife he'd stolen from her kitchen. Molly woke to the blade at her throat, to his weight pinning her down, to the terrifying realization that she had welcomed evil into her home. The struggle was brief. Somkid had refined his technique through 6 previous murders. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly where to cut to cause maximum pain while prolonging consciousness. Molly died slowly, aware of every violation, every wound, every final heartbeat. But Somkid made his second critical mistake. In his post-murder euphoria, he fell asleep in Molly's apartment. He woke at dawn to sounds outside, neighbors heading to work, delivery trucks rumbling past. He had stayed too long. He gathered his belongings hastily, wiped surfaces he remembered touching, and slipped out into the early morning chaos. He thought he'd been careful. He was wrong. A neighbor saw him leaving. The neighbor, an elderly woman who kept watch over the building like a self-appointed guardian, noted the unfamiliar man exiting Molly's apartment at an unusual hour. When Molly's body was discovered that afternoon by a friend who came to check on her, the neighbor volunteered her observation to police. More importantly, the building had recently installed a security camera at the entrance, a cheap system with poor resolution, but functional enough to capture grainy footage of Somkid leaving the premises. For the first time, investigators had video evidence. The footage was analyzed, enhanced, distributed to every police station in Bangkok. Thongchai studied the images until he could see the man's face when he closed his eyes. The resolution was poor, the man's features blurred and indistinct, but body language, gait, approximate age were all visible. This was their best lead yet. The media ran the footage constantly. Newspapers printed still images. Tips multiplied. Among hundreds of false leads came several that pointed to the same individual. A man named Samkid Pumpuang, known to frequent working-class neighborhoods, known to take odd jobs, known to be friendly with single women. The name appeared 3 times from different sources, enough correlation to warrant serious investigation. Thong Chai pulled records on Samkid Pumpuang. No major criminal history, just minor offenses. Petty theft as a teenager, a few drunk and disorderly incidents, the sort of background that marks someone as rough around the edges but not dangerous. Employment history was spotty, addresses constantly changing, relationships non-existent. The profile of a drifter, someone who moved through society without leaving deep footprints. But several witnesses confirmed seeing Samkid in proximity to multiple victims before their deaths. He had been at the market where Pensri shopped. He had taken the same bus route as Ratana. He had been seen at the temple with Molly. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, but Thongchai needed something concrete. Fingerprints, DNA, a definitive connection. He obtained a warrant to search any known addresses associated with Samkid, but the man had vanished. The media attention had spooked him. He had abandoned his rented room, left no forwarding information, disappeared into Bangkok's vast underground economy where millions survive without leaving paper trails. Thongchai knew that Samkid would kill again. The compulsion was too strong, the gaps between murders shortening rather than lengthening. The detective implemented a strategy that was both brilliant and desperate. He planted undercover female officers in neighborhoods matching the victim profile. These women, trained and armed, posed as vulnerable targets. Single mothers, night shift workers, women living alone. It was dangerous, controversial, and probably the only way to catch a predator who selected victims so carefully. For 2 months, the operation ran without results. Samkid had either left Bangkok or gone completely dormant. Then, in February 2007, one of the undercover officers reported contact with a man matching Samkid's description. He had approached her at a bus stop, offered to help carry groceries, engaged in friendly conversation. The encounter seemed harmless but triggered every alarm bell in her trained instincts. She reported the incident, provided a description. Thongchai reviewed the report and felt the first surge of genuine hope in months. This could be him. Surveillance teams were mobilized. The undercover officer continued her routine, allowing the relationship to develop naturally. Samkid, if this was indeed Samkid, followed his usual pattern. He appeared repeatedly, always friendly, slowly building trust. He learned her schedule, asked about her life, positioned himself as helpful and harmless. He was patient, but surveillance teams were more patient. They documented every encounter, photographed the suspect from every angle, waited for him to make a definitive move. On March 15, 2007, Samkid asked if he could visit the officer's apartment. A fabricated story about needing to use a bathroom urgently. This was the moment Thongchai had been waiting for. The undercover officer agreed. She led Samkid to her apartment, actually a police safe house rigged with cameras and surrounded by tactical teams. The moment Samkid crossed the threshold, officers moved in. The arrest was swift, overwhelming, perfectly executed. Samkid had no time to resist, no opportunity to flee. One moment he was following a potential victim into an apartment. The next he was face down on the floor, hands cuffed behind his back, officers screaming commands. In Samkid's bag, police found a knife, rope, and gloves, a murder kit. In his wallet, they found identification confirming his identity. Fingerprints taken at the station matched prints from multiple crime scenes. DNA samples matched biological evidence from 3 victims. The case that had tormented Bangkok for nearly 2 years was finally solved. The silk strangler had been caught. The interrogation room in Bangkok's Metropolitan Police Bureau smelled of stale coffee and fear. The residual anxiety of hundreds of suspects who had occupied the metal chair now holding Samkid Pumpuang. Detective Thongchai sat across the scarred table, studying the man responsible for 7 confirmed murders and potentially more. Samkid appeared utterly ordinary in the fluorescent light. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of face that disappears in crowds. But his eyes, Thongchai had learned to read eyes after 2 decades in homicide, held something reptilian, an absence of normal human warmth that made the detective's skin crawl despite professional detachment. Thai law doesn't require Miranda-style warnings, but Thongchai informed Somkid that his statements could be used against him, that legal counsel was available if requested. Somkid waved away the offer with surprising casualness. He seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if carrying the secret of his crimes had become more exhausting than the prospect of punishment. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in Thai criminal history. Somkid spoke for 11 hours over 2 days, describing each murder with disturbing clarity. He recalled specific details, what victims wore, how they struggled, what sounds they made dying. He showed no remorse, no emotional connection to the lives he'd extinguished. The women were not people to him. They were opportunities, experiences, moments of absolute power in a life where he otherwise felt powerless and invisible. He described the sensation of strangling someone, feeling pulse slow beneath his fingers, watching eyes dim, controlling the exact moment of death. He spoke about it the way others might describe a particularly satisfying meal or an impressive sunset, with detached appreciation for the experience itself. Thongchai asked the question that always haunts investigators dealing with serial killers. Why? What childhood trauma? What psychological break? What specific moment transformed a human being into a predator? Somkid's answer was both simple and unsatisfying. There was no dramatic origin story, no clear turning point. His childhood in rural Kon Kaen was marked by poverty but not exceptional abuse. His father was distant but not violent. His mother was neglectful but not monstrous. He described feeling different from early age, disconnected from others, unable to form genuine emotional bonds, fascinated by suffering in ways that disturbed him even as a child. He killed his first animal, a neighbor's cat, at age 12, strangling it slowly, watching it die. The experience produced a rush unlike anything he'd felt before, a combination of sexual arousal and psychological satisfaction that became addictive. He killed other animals throughout adolescence, developing techniques, discovering what methods produced the most interesting reactions. The progression from animals to humans was, in his telling, almost inevitable. The fantasy became insufficient. He needed human suffering to achieve the same psychological release. What made Somkid's case particularly disturbing to forensic psychologists who evaluated him was his complete lack of delusional thinking. He wasn't driven by voices or hallucinations. He harbored no belief that victims deserved death or that he was on some mission. He killed simply because he wanted to, because it felt good, because the anticipation, execution, and memory of murder satisfied something fundamental in his psychological wiring. He was what specialists call a hedonistic serial killer, someone who kills primarily for pleasure rather than anger, mission, or psychosis. During confession, Somkid revealed details that confirmed investigators' worst fears. There were more victims than the confirmed 7. He described additional murders dating back to 2004, before police recognized a pattern. A woman in Nakhon Ratchasima province in 2004. 2 more in Bangkok neighborhoods outside the initial investigation's focus. The total body count climbed to 10 confirmed victims, with several more suspected cases where evidence was insufficient for definitive attribution. Each revelation opened old wounds for families who had buried loved ones, believing their deaths were isolated incidents rather than part of a serial killer's spree. Media coverage of Somkid's arrest and confession dominated Thai news for weeks. Television programs dissected every aspect of the case. Criminologists and psychologists appeared on talk shows, attempting to explain the inexplicable. How could someone so ordinary commit such extraordinary evil? How did he evade capture for so long? What failures in society, family structure, or law enforcement allowed this to happen? The public reaction split along predictable lines. Some demanded immediate execution. Thailand retained the death penalty, and serial murder certainly qualified for capital punishment. Others advocated for psychiatric imprisonment, arguing that Somkid's psychological abnormalities made him more suitable for study than execution. Victim families united in their desire for the harshest possible sentence. Their grief transmuted into rage that sought the only justice available, watching the man who destroyed their lives face consequences. The trial began in September 2007, held in Bangkok Criminal Court under unprecedented security. Samkid faced 10 counts of premeditated murder, multiple counts of sexual assault, and various lesser charges. His defense attorneys, court-appointed, as Samkid possessed no resources to hire private counsel, attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting that his psychological abnormalities reduced his culpability. Psychiatric experts testified about antisocial personality disorder, about the neurological differences found in psychopathic individuals, about how Samkid's brain might be fundamentally different from normal humans. The prosecution, led by senior public prosecutor Siriporn Ratnachit, systematically demolished the diminished capacity argument. She presented evidence showing Samkid's crimes were meticulously planned, demonstrating clear understanding of right and wrong, of legal consequences, of the need to hide his actions. He selected victims carefully. He groomed them patiently. He avoided detection through deliberate choices. These were not the actions of someone incapable of understanding his behavior. These were the calculated moves of an intelligent predator who simply chose evil. Victim impact statements consumed an entire day of testimony. Family members described lives shattered, children traumatized, economic devastation from losing primary breadwinners. Pensri's sister described finding her niece catatonic with shock, unable to speak for weeks, requiring years of therapy that the family couldn't afford. Molly's elderly parents traveled from the north, their faces carved into masks of grief, to describe waiting for monthly remittances that suddenly stopped, learning their daughter had been murdered only when police finally tracked them down. Ratana's daughter, now 8 years old, testified briefly. The judge allowed it over defense objections, describing nightmares that never stopped, describing her fear of men, describing how she still sometimes forgot her mother was dead and would wake up calling for her. Samkid sat through all of it with the same blank expression he wore throughout the trial. He showed no reaction to testimony, no response to victim photographs displayed for the court, no acknowledgement that these were human beings whose lives he'd stolen. His affectless demeanor was perhaps more disturbing than open sadism would have been. At least sadism implied emotional engagement. Samkid's emptiness suggested something far more alien, a consciousness operating by rules fundamentally different from normal human psychology. The trial lasted 3 months, an eternity for Thai courts where cases typically resolve in weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic matches, survivor testimony, video footage, confession. The defense mounted what arguments they could, but the outcome was never in doubt. On December 12, 2007, the 3-judge panel delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, announced in the flat bureaucratic tone Thai judges employ for even the gravest pronouncements, was death by lethal injection for each count of murder, sentences to run consecutively rather than concurrently. In practical terms, Samkid Pumpuang was condemned to die. Thailand's death penalty exists in theory but functions sporadically in practice. Executions are rare, often delayed for years or decades by appeals and royal clemency considerations. Samkid was transferred to Bang Kwang Central Prison, the infamous facility nicknamed the Bangkok Hilton by foreigners, where Thailand houses its most dangerous criminals. He joined approximately 500 other inmates awaiting execution in a system where death row prisoners can languish for decades. Inside Bang Kwang, Samkid's life contracted to a 6 by 8 foot cell, 23 hours of daily confinement, 1 hour of exercise in a caged yard. He was kept isolated from general population for his own protection. Even hardened criminals maintain hierarchies of revulsion, and child-sparing serial killers occupy an ambiguous position, despised but not quite as much as child killers. He received psychological evaluation regularly, participated in mandatory counseling sessions, and showed the same affectless cooperation he displayed throughout his trial. Prison psychologists noted his adaptation to confinement was unusually smooth. He seemed to experience neither anxiety about his fate nor distress about his circumstances. He simply existed, waiting for death with the same patience he'd once employed stalking victims. Appeals wound through Thailand's judicial system with glacial slowness. Samkid's attorneys, now a different team of public defenders mandated to represent death row inmates, filed motions challenging evidence admissibility, arguing constitutional violations, requesting sentence reductions based on psychiatric factors. Each appeal was denied at successively higher court levels. By 2010, his case had exhausted all automatic appeals. Only royal clemency remained as a potential reprieve, and no one seriously believed the king would grant mercy to a serial killer who had terrorized Bangkok and shown zero remorse. The families of Somkid's victims existed in a different kind of prison. Physical scars heal, but psychological wounds inflicted by violent murder persist across generations. Pensri's daughter, now a teenager, struggled with depression and trust issues that manifested in self-harm and academic failure. Ratana's daughter was raised by relatives who tried their best but couldn't replace her mother or erase the trauma of that night. Samsri's son dropped out of school, fell into drug addiction, ended up incarcerated himself for petty crimes. A trajectory that might have been different if his mother had survived to guide him. The ripple effects of Somkid's murders extended far beyond his 10 victims, touching dozens of lives, creating cascades of suffering that would persist long after he was gone. Bangkok itself bore scars from the case. The Silk Strangler fundamentally altered how working-class women approach safety. The casual trust that once characterized tight-knit neighborhoods evaporated, replaced by suspicion and hypervigilance. Women who once thought nothing of inviting friendly acquaintances inside now triple-locked their doors and installed security cameras they could barely afford. The psychological tax imposed by serial killers extends beyond their direct victims. Entire communities learn to live in fear, modifying behavior, surrendering freedoms, paying the price for one predator's actions. Law enforcement underwent substantial changes in response to the case's revelations. The initial investigative failures, the slow recognition of a serial pattern, the lack of coordination between districts, the inadequate forensic capabilities, prompted reforms. Bangkok police established a dedicated unit for serial crimes, improved DNA analysis capabilities, implemented better data sharing systems between districts. Detective Thongchai, promoted to inspector after successfully closing the case, led training programs teaching officers to recognize serial crime patterns earlier. The lessons learned from hunting Somkid Pumpuang would help catch future predators faster, though that provided cold comfort to families whose loved ones died while police were still learning. In 2012, 5 years after his conviction, Somkid gave his first and only interview to a Thai journalist specializing in criminal psychology. The interview, conducted through prison bars with corrections officers present, revealed a man fundamentally unchanged by incarceration or impending death. Asked if he felt remorse, Somkid responded with a question: "Do you feel remorse for swatting a mosquito?" The women he killed were, in his worldview, simply less significant than himself. Their desires, fears, dreams, families, none of it registered as meaningful. He understood intellectually that society condemned his actions, but he couldn't grasp why on an emotional level. The interview concluded with the journalist asking what Somkid thought about when alone in his cell. His answer chilled even the experienced reporter. I remember all of it. And sometimes, I close my eyes and it's like I'm there again, and everything is perfect." On March 24, 2018, a decade after his trial concluded, Somkid Pumpuang was informed that his execution would proceed within 48 hours. Thailand had recently resumed executions after a de facto moratorium, and Somkid's case, given its notoriety and the completeness of his guilt, was selected for the restart. He received the news with the same flat effect he'd displayed throughout his incarceration. He declined a final statement. He refused religious counsel. He ate his last meal, a simple rice dish, nothing elaborate, and spent his final hours sleeping peacefully, according to corrections officers who maintained watch. The execution occurred by lethal injection in Bang Kwang's death chamber, a clinical space designed to sanitize the act of state-sanctioned killing. Somkid was strapped to a gurney, intravenous lines inserted, chemicals administered in sequence. Sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to paralyze muscles, potassium chloride to stop the heart. The process took 8 minutes from first injection to confirmed death. Witnesses, including Thongchai, several victim family members, and required officials, watched through a window as the man who had terrorized Bangkok simply stopped existing. His body was cremated per prison protocol, ashes scattered in an unmarked location. No grave marks his passing. No monument recalls his name except in crime databases and academic studies of serial murder. The families of his victims received notification of the execution's completion. Some felt closure, others felt only emptiness, the realization that his death couldn't restore what he'd taken. Justice had been served in the limited sense that courts recognize, but justice cannot resurrect the dead, cannot untraumatize children, cannot give back the decades of life stolen. In the years since Somkid's execution, criminologists and forensic psychologists have studied his case extensively, searching for patterns and warning signs that might help identify future predators before they kill. His case appears in textbooks on serial murder, in academic papers about psychopathy, in training materials for law enforcement worldwide. He has become, in death, a cautionary tale and educational tool. His evil repurposed to potentially prevent future evil. But the most lasting legacy of Somkid Pumpuang isn't academic or procedural. It's the simple, terrible knowledge he forced upon Bangkok's working class, that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who smiles warmly, speaks kindly, and offers help when you need it most. Sometimes evil walks through your front door wearing the mask of friendship, and by the time you see what's underneath, it's too late to scream. The families of his victims continue living, carrying scars invisible to casual observers. They wake up every morning in a world where their loved ones should exist but don't, where the empty spaces at dinner tables and family gatherings mark permanent absences. They navigate birthdays and holidays with the weight of grief that never fully lifts. They wonder about the lives that should have been, the grandchildren never born, the achievements never accomplished, the ordinary moments of joy stolen before they could occur. Pensri's daughter, now a woman in her 30s, works as a counselor for crime victims, transforming her trauma into purpose. Ratana's daughter teaches kindergarten, trying to provide the stability she never had to other vulnerable children. Molly's friends maintain a small memorial at the temple where she met her killer, lighting incense and leaving flowers on the anniversary of her death. These small acts of remembrance ensure that Somkid's victims are defined by more than how they died, that they're remembered as full human beings who lived, loved, laughed, and mattered. Bangkok has moved on in the way cities do, absorbing tragedy and continuing forward. New buildings rise where crime scenes once stood. Different families occupy apartments where women died. The younger generation knows the Silk Strangler only as a historical footnote, a scary story older relatives tell. But those who lived through that era of fear, who locked their doors with trembling hands and jumped at shadows, who lost friends or family members to a predator who looked so utterly normal, they remember. They carry the knowledge that civilization's veneer is thinner than we like to believe, that the difference between safety and horror can be as simple as trusting the wrong smile, opening the door to the wrong person, believing that someone kind couldn't possibly be someone dangerous. The story of Somkid Pumpuang ends not with his death, but with a question that echoes through every serial killer case. How many potential monsters walk among us, wearing masks so perfect that we never suspect what lies beneath until it's too late? How many friendly faces hide predatory minds? How many helpful hands could just as easily become strangling hands? We can't live in constant paranoia, that's no way to exist. But we also can't afford complete naivete. Somewhere between those extremes lies the vigilance that keeps us safe without sacrificing our humanity. The beast that hunted Bangkok's nights is dead and gone, cremated to ash and scattered to wind. But the memory of what he did, the lessons written in blood across a decade of terror, remain. 10 women died teaching those lessons. Countless others lived diminished lives, carrying trauma that never heals. And somewhere in Thailand's working-class neighborhoods, someone is probably opening their door right now to a friendly stranger, offering shelter, providing trust, believing in the fundamental goodness of people. Most of the time, that trust is rewarded. Most strangers are exactly what they appear to be. Most friendly faces hide nothing more sinister than ordinary human complexity. But sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the monster walks through the door you opened. And by the time you realize your mistake, it's far too late to do anything but become another name in a case file, another victim in a killer's count, another lesson for those who survive to learn from your tragedy. That's the true horror Som Kid Pumpuang embodied. Not just what he did, but what he represented. The reminder that trust, while necessary for human society to function, always carries risk. The knowledge that we can't always tell the hunters from the hunted until the moment of the kill. The terrible truth that sometimes the deadliest threat isn't the stranger in the alley. It's the familiar face sitting across your table, waiting for you to close your eyes and sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, Nasser Demirji story. Some men hide their darkness behind closed doors, but he displayed his in plain sight, hanging in butcher shops across town, because the meat in his shop wasn't always animal. We're about to descend into the mind of a man who learned that the best place to hide a body is in plain sight. Wrapped in paper, priced by the pound, sold to neighbors who never suspected the monster serving them was feeding them something unspeakable. This is the story of Nasser Demirji, the man who turned murder into a business model. The coastal city of Nabil sprawled along Tunisia's northeastern shores like a jewel forgotten by time. Whitewashed buildings climbed hillsides overlooking the Mediterranean, their walls absorbing centuries of salt air and secrets. Markets burst with color: crimson pomegranates, golden dates, silver fish pulled fresh from the morning tide. The scent of jasmine mingled with grilled meat, spices, and humanity pressed together in narrow streets that had witnessed empires rise and crumble. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than disease, where privacy was a luxury few could afford, or so they thought. Nasser Demirji moved through these streets like smoke, present but unnoticed, there but not there. He was a butcher, one of several in the Medina, his shop wedged between a pottery merchant and a fabric seller whose bolts of cloth swayed in the sea breeze. The shop was unremarkable. A narrow space with hooks hanging from the ceiling, a wooden chopping block stained dark from years of use, a glass case displaying cuts of lamb and beef arranged with surprising precision. Demirji himself was equally unremarkable: average height, average build, a face that seemed designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away. But his hands. Those who paid attention noticed his hands. They were large, disproportionately so, with thick fingers that moved with surgical precision when wielding a cleaver. The knuckles were perpetually raw, scrubbed clean but never quite free of the redness that comes from constant contact with flesh and blood. He kept his nails trimmed short, filed to smooth edges, and his palms bore calluses that spoke of decades handling bone and sinew. These were hands that understood anatomy in ways medical students could only study from textbooks. Demirji opened his shop each morning at dawn, arriving before the sun painted the sky pink. Neighbors claimed they heard sounds from within before he unlocked the door: the wet thud of meat against wood, the scrape of blade against stone, the creak of chains as carcasses were hoisted onto hooks. By the time customers arrived, everything was arranged perfectly. Cuts of meat glistened in the morning light, each piece separated and labeled with meticulous care. The floor was scrubbed clean, the sawdust fresh, the air heavy with the metallic sweetness of raw protein. He spoke little. When customers entered, he nodded, listened to their orders, and fulfilled them with mechanical efficiency. His knife work was mesmerizing. The blade seemed to know where to cut before his hand moved, separating muscle from bone, fat from lean, gristle from tender meat with movements so fluid they appeared choreographed. Women praised his skill, claiming his cuts cooked more evenly than meat from other shops. Men admired his prices, always competitive, sometimes suspiciously low. "How do you manage such prices?" one customer asked. Demirji smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I source my own product, cuts out the middleman." The answer satisfied most. Tunisia's economy in the 1970s was struggling, inflation eating at family budgets like rust on iron. People didn't ask too many questions when they could stretch their dinars further. They simply bought their meat, thanked the quiet butcher, and returned home to feed their families. But some people did disappear, not in dramatic fashion, not in ways that demanded immediate investigation. Tunisia was a nation in transition, caught between traditional values and modernizing forces. People left villages for cities, cities for other countries, families for opportunities elsewhere. Young women seeking work in Tunis or abroad, men chasing construction jobs in Libya, elderly folks who wandered off, their minds clouded by age and confusion. The list of missing persons grew slowly, like water filling a bucket one drop at a time, noticeable only when you finally looked down and saw it was nearly overflowing. Among the missing was a young woman named Fatima Garbai, 23 years old, dark hair that fell past her shoulders, eyes the color of olives, a smile that made strangers feel like old friends. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers dancing across fabric with the same precision Demirji's fingers danced across meat. She was saving money to marry her fiancé, a fisherman whose boat brought indecent catches when the sea was generous. Fatima disappeared on a Thursday evening in March 1975. She left her workplace at 6, telling her employer she needed to run an errand before heading home. Her route would have taken her through the Medina, past the butcher shops and spice vendors, the metalworkers hammering copper into decorative trays, the old men sipping mint tea outside cafes. She never arrived home. Her fiancé reported her missing the next morning. Police took statements, filed paperwork, added her name to a list already too long. They checked hospitals, morgues, bus stations. They questioned known troublemakers and recently released criminals. They found nothing. Fatima had simply vanished, as though the narrow streets of Nablus had swallowed her whole. 3 weeks later, another woman disappeared. Then a month after that, another. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid panic, but consistent enough that a few people, those who paid attention, those whose minds cataloged details others missed, began to notice. During this time, Demirji's business thrived. His customer base grew. People claimed his meat was superior, more tender, with a flavor they couldn't quite identify but found strangely addictive. Some customers became regulars, visiting weekly or even twice weekly, claiming no other butcher could satisfy their needs quite like Demirji could. "What's your secret?" a woman asked, clutching a package of cutlets wrapped in brown paper stained with blood. "Fresh product," Demirji replied, wiping his cleaver on his apron. "Very fresh." The shop had a back room. Customers occasionally glimpsed it when Demirji pushed through the curtain separating the retail space from whatever lay beyond. The curtain was thick, made from heavy canvas that absorbed sound. On the rare occasions it was pulled aside, people caught glimpses of darkness, shadows, shapes hanging from ceiling hooks that might have been meat carcasses but were always too deep in shadow to identify clearly. No one asked to see the back room. In Tunisian culture, especially then, boundaries were respected. A man's business was his business. Privacy was sacred. To pry was to insult, and insults had consequences in tight-knit communities where reputation determined survival. But curiosity is a powerful force. It gnaws at the mind like rats gnawing at foundation timbers, persistent and destructive. A few brave souls, or perhaps foolish ones, tried to peer beyond that curtain, to solve the mystery of what made Demirji's meat so exceptional. One such person was Hassan, a teenager with more courage than sense. He worked for his uncle's grocery store, delivering orders throughout the Medina. His route sometimes took him past Demirji's shop around closing time, when the butcher was cleaning up for the day. Hassan had heard whispers, rumors, half-formed suspicions that adults discussed in lowered voices when they thought children weren't listening. One evening, curiosity won. Hassan waited until Demirji left the shop briefly, perhaps to dump waste in the alley behind the building, and slipped inside. The front room was empty, silent except for the buzz of flies investigating blood spots the butcher had missed. Hassan moved toward the curtain, his heart hammering so hard he was certain the sound would alert the entire Medina. He pushed the curtain aside. Darkness greeted him. The back room had no windows, no light source except whatever spilled in from the front. Hassan's eyes struggled to adjust. He could make out shapes, the hooks he'd suspected, what appeared to be a large table, shelves lining the walls, containers of various sizes. The smell hit him like a fist. Blood, yes, but also chemicals, something sharp and astringent that burned his nostrils. Beneath that, something else, something wrong, something rotting. Hassan took one step forward, then another. His foot touched something on the floor, soft, yielding, organic. He looked down but couldn't see clearly in the darkness. He bent, reaching out with trembling fingers. The shop's front door slammed open. Hassan's heart stopped. He heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving toward the curtain, toward him. He stumbled backward, colliding with something hanging from a hook. It swung, creaking, brushing against his shoulder. The texture was wrong, too smooth in places, too rough in others. His mind refused to process what his hands were telling him. The footsteps stopped just outside the curtain. Hassan held his breath. Seconds stretched into eternities. He could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears, feel sweat sliding down his spine despite the cool evening air. The curtain rustled slightly, as though disturbed by breath on the other side. Then the footsteps retreated. The front door opened and closed. Silence descended like a burial shroud. Hassan didn't move for several minutes. When he finally did, he ran, bursting through the curtain, racing past the chopping block and glass case, exploding into the street like a man escaping hell itself. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs threatened to collapse, until he reached his uncle's store and locked himself in the bathroom, vomiting until nothing remained but bile and terror. He never spoke of what he'd seen, or more accurately, what he hadn't seen but had felt, smelled, intuited, because sometimes the mind protects itself by refusing to acknowledge certain truths. Sometimes survival depends on not knowing, not questioning, not connecting dots that form pictures too horrifying to contemplate. But Hassan stopped eating meat, all meat. For the rest of his life, the sight of raw flesh would bring him to the edge of panic, his body remembering what his mind refused to process. Demirji noticed Hassan's flight. He noticed everything. That was his talent. Observation without appearing to observe, awareness without drawing attention. He understood that curiosity was dangerous, that secrets required constant vigilance, that predators survived by being smarter, more patient, more careful than their prey. That night, after closing his shop, Demirji cleaned the back room with unusual thoroughness. He scrubbed surfaces, rearranged inventory, disposed of certain items that had outlived their usefulness. He worked methodically, humming tunelessly, his large hands moving with practiced efficiency. By dawn, when he opened the shop again, everything appeared normal. Fresh sawdust on the floor, clean knives arranged by size, meat displayed in the glass case, each cut precise and appetizing. Just another day in Nabil. Just another butcher serving his community. Just another monster hiding in plain sight, protected by the very ordinariness that made him invisible. Because the greatest trick predators ever learned was this: blend in so perfectly that people look directly at you and see nothing wrong. Become so normal, so unremarkable, so forgettable that suspicion slides off like water off oiled leather. Nasser Demirji had mastered this trick, and he would continue mastering it for years to come, his darkness growing, his hunger escalating, his shop serving as both storefront and tomb, feeding the very community it was destroying. The butcher of Nabil was just getting started. Time moves differently for predators. While normal people measure their lives in years, seasons, holidays, and milestones, hunters measure time in opportunities. In moments when guard drops, in hours when witnesses vanish, in seconds when hesitation means escape or capture. Nasser Demirji measured his life in bodies. By 1978, his collection had grown. Not rapidly, he was too careful for that, but steadily, like interest accumulating in a bank account no one audited. The missing persons list for Nabil and surrounding areas had swelled to 17. 17 names. 17 faces on posters that yellowed and peeled from walls. 17 families trapped in purgatory, unable to mourn because mourning required certainty, and certainty required bodies. Bodies Demirji had ensured would never be found. Not intact, anyway. His methodology was sophisticated, refined through repetition into something approaching art. He targeted carefully those on society's margins, people whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation, prostitutes who worked the docks, homeless individuals whose families had already abandoned them, migrants passing through Tunisia on their way to Europe, people with no local connections, no one to report them missing. He studied his prey like a biologist studies specimens, learning patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, waiting for perfect moments. The actual kills were almost anticlimactic. Demirji wasn't theatrical. He didn't torture or play games. Death came swiftly, efficiently, with the same professional detachment he applied to slaughtering livestock. A blow to the head to stun, followed by precise cuts that drained blood quickly, minimizing mess and struggle. He'd learned these techniques during his apprenticeship decades earlier, when he was just a boy learning the butcher's trade from his father. Now there was a memory that still brought a smile to Demirji's face. The old man had been strict, demanding perfection in every cut, every motion, every aspect of the craft. He'd beaten young Nasser when mistakes were made, his belt leaving welts that lasted days. But he'd also taught invaluable lessons about anatomy, about how bodies were fundamentally similar across species, about how meat was just meat once you stripped away the sentimentality. An animal is a machine for producing protein, his father had said, hands red to the elbows as he broke down a goat carcass. Nothing more. No soul, no special significance. Just muscle and bone and fat arranged in predictable patterns. Young Nasser had absorbed this philosophy. Over time, he'd expanded it. If animals were just machines, then what were people? Weren't they simply more complex machines? More meat to process, more bones to separate, more useful components to be rendered down to their essential elements. This logic had sustained him for decades. It allowed him to sleep peacefully, to interact with customers without guilt, to view his activities not as crimes but as a different kind of business. Supply and demand. He supplied what customers wanted, quality meat at good prices, and the demand was insatiable. That some of his supply came from unconventional sources was merely a detail, no more significant than whether beef came from grass-fed or grain-fed cattle. But even the most careful predator makes mistakes. Even the most sophisticated system develops flaws. And Nasser Demirji, for all his intelligence and caution, was about to discover that perfection is impossible to maintain forever. The beginning of his end started with a dog. Not just any dog. A mangy street cur that survived by scavenging trash and begging scraps from sympathetic shopkeepers. This particular animal had developed a habit of lurking near Demirji's shop, drawn by smells that promised food. Demirji tolerated it initially, occasionally tossing scraps to keep it from becoming a nuisance. But dogs, unlike humans, possess instincts uncorrupted by social conditioning. This dog sensed something wrong about Demirji's shop, something that triggered ancient predator recognition algorithms embedded in its DNA. It began acting strangely when near the butcher, hackles raised, teeth bared, a low growl rumbling from its chest. Other shopkeepers noticed. "Your shop scares that dog," the fabric merchant observed. "Never seen anything like it." Demirji shrugged. Dogs are unpredictable, but the observation planted seeds. People began paying attention, noticing details they'd previously overlooked. The shop was always closed on Fridays, Tunisia's holy day, which seemed reasonable. But it was also closed random other days, sometimes for 2 or 3 days straight, with no explanation posted. During these closures, neighbors reported hearing sounds from within. Scraping, dragging, the clang of metal on metal. "Maybe he's renovating," someone suggested. "For 3 years," another replied. "How much renovation does a butcher shop need?" Then came the smell. All butcher shops smell. That's unavoidable when dealing with raw meat. But the smell from Demirji's shop was different. Sharper, more chemical, like the antiseptic stench of hospitals mixed with something organic and decaying. On hot summer days, it became overwhelming, driving customers from nearby shops to cover their noses and hurry past. The fabric merchant complained to local authorities. "Something's wrong over there. The smell is killing my business." A health inspector was dispatched. His name was Rashid Mansour, a bureaucrat in his 40s who'd spent 20 years inspecting restaurants, markets, and food vendors throughout the region. He'd seen every health code violation imaginable: rats in kitchens, expired meat relabeled and resold, workers with infectious diseases handling food. Nothing shocked him anymore, or so he thought. Mansour arrived at Demirji's shop on a Wednesday morning in August 1978. The heat was suffocating, the kind of dry North African heat that made shadows valuable as gold. The shop was open, Demirji behind the counter serving a customer, an elderly woman buying lamb for that evening's dinner. "Inspector," Demirji said, his face neutral, "how can I help you?" Mansour explained the complaint, maintaining professional courtesy. "Just a routine inspection. I'm sure everything's in order." Demirji nodded slowly. "Of course. Let me finish with this customer." The inspector waited, his trained eyes scanning the visible space. Everything appeared normal. Clean floors, organized workspace, meat properly stored in the refrigerated case. Perhaps the complaint was exaggerated. Perhaps neighbors were simply sensitive. Then he noticed the curtain leading to the back room, the heavy canvas that absorbed sound, that had protected Demirji's secrets for years. "I'll need to inspect the storage area as well," Mansour said. Something flickered across Demirji's face. It lasted maybe half a second, a micro-expression of concern, calculation, decision. Then the mask of normalcy returned. "Of course, though it's quite cluttered back there. I've been meaning to organize." They moved toward the curtain. The elderly customer left, door chiming as it closed. Now only two men remained in the shop, the inspector and the butcher. Hunter and prey, though which was which remained unclear. Demirji pulled the curtain aside. The smell hit Mansour like a physical force. His eyes watered, his stomach clenched. He'd smelled death before. Spoiled meat, rotting carcasses, the sweet corruption of decomposition. But this was different. This was death mixed with chemicals, with cleaning agents trying desperately to mask something unmaskable. The back room was larger than expected, stretching deep into the building. Meat hooks hung from ceiling beams, a drain in the floor's center, shelves lined with containers, a heavy wooden table stained so dark it was nearly black, tools arranged with military precision. Saws, cleavers, boning knives, instruments Mansour couldn't identify. "Your storage area," Demirji said from behind him. Mansour stepped inside. His foot touched something wet. He looked down. The floor, despite appearing clean, was slick. Fresh liquid pooled around the drain. Red-brown liquid that his mind insisted was water mixed with meat residue, but his gut knew was something else. He moved deeper into the room. His flashlight beam cut through darkness, illuminating details the limited light from the front shop couldn't reach. One of the containers on the shelves was partially open. Inside, he glimpsed something pale and curved. Mansour's hand trembled as he reached for the container. His rational mind screamed warnings, told him to leave, to return with police, to not touch anything. But curiosity, that same fatal curiosity that killed Hassan's innocence, compelled him forward. He opened the container fully. Inside were bones, cleaned, sorted by size, arranged with obsessive care. Human bones. He recognized the skull immediately. Even without forensic training, even without medical education, certain shapes are unmistakable. The eye sockets, the jaw structure, the way the cranium curved, these weren't from any animal sold in markets. Mansour's breath came in short gasps. His vision tunneled. The room spun. He backed away from the container, his mind refusing to process implications, refusing to construct the narrative that these bones demanded. He turned to run. Demirji blocked the exit. The butcher's expression had changed. The mask of normalcy had cracked, revealing something underneath. Not anger, not fear, something colder, calculating, the expression of a man solving a problem. You shouldn't have looked, Demirji said quietly. Mansour tried to speak. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He was a bureaucrat, a desk worker, a man whose confrontations involved paperwork and regulations, not physical violence. He had no experience with the kind of danger currently standing between him and escape. Demirji moved with surprising speed for a man his size. His large hands, those hands that customers had admired, that had wielded cleavers with surgical precision, reached for Mansour's throat. But Mansour was younger, faster, driven by pure survival instinct. He dodged left, grabbed a cleaver from the nearby table, swung wildly. The blade caught Demirji's shoulder, cutting through fabric and flesh. Blood sprayed, bright red, shockingly red, human red. Demirji grunted but didn't fall. He grabbed Mansour's wrist, twisting until bones ground together, until the inspector dropped the cleaver with a cry of pain. They struggled, crashing into shelves, knocking containers to the floor. Bones scattered across the wet tiles like macabre dice. Mansour's hand found another tool, a bone saw, its serrated edge catching light from the front room. He swung upward, catching Demirji across the face. The butcher stumbled backward, blood streaming from a gash that ran from cheek to ear. This time, Mansour didn't hesitate. He ran through the curtain, past the chopping block, out the front door into blinding sunlight and heat and a world that suddenly seemed impossibly precious. He ran screaming into the Medina, shouting for police, for help, for anyone who would listen. Behind him, in the butcher shop, Nasser Demirji stood among his scattered secrets. Blood dripped from his face, his shoulder, pooling at his feet. He looked at the bones covering his floor, the containers knocked over, the evidence now impossible to hide. For the first time in decades, the butcher felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of consequences, he'd always known this day might come, but fear of failure. Fear that his carefully constructed system, his perfect methodology, was crumbling. Fear that the ordinary butcher, the invisible man, was about to become very visible indeed. Outside, Mansour's shouts had attracted attention. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores. Customers stopped mid-transaction. A policeman, one of two stationed in the Medina, came running, his hand on his holstered pistol. The butcher, Mansour gasped, pointing back toward Demirji's shop. The butcher shop. There are bodies, bones, human bones. The crowd's murmur became a roar. The policeman radioed for backup, then drew his weapon and approached the shop carefully. Other men followed, emboldened by numbers, their curiosity overcoming fear. They found Demirji attempting to clean up, trying desperately to restore order to chaos. But it was too late. The secret was out. The darkness was exposed. The ordinary butcher had become extraordinary in the worst possible way. When police stormed the back room minutes later, they found a chamber of horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bones sorted by type, femurs with femurs, ribs with ribs, skulls lined up like trophies. Containers of preserved organs, notebooks documenting weights, dates, methods, a journal describing victims with the same clinical detachment Demirji had applied to livestock. And in the refrigerator, packages wrapped in brown paper, labeled with prices, ready for sale. The investigation that followed would reveal that at least 14 victims had passed through Demirji's shop. 14 people reduced to components, to meat and bone and fat. Some had been sold to customers. Some had been disposed of through methods police discovered but refused to make public. Some remained in the shop, waiting for processing. The butcher of Nabil had finally been caught. But the horror was just beginning, because now authorities faced a question with no good answer. How many people had unknowingly consumed Demirji's product? How many families had eaten dinner not knowing the source? How many customers had praised the quality, the flavor, the tenderness of meat that came from their neighbors, their family members, their own community? The monster was in custody, but the nightmare was only starting. News of Demirji's arrest spread through Tunisia like wildfire through drought-dead grass. Within hours, every radio station was broadcasting updates. By evening, the story had reached Tunis, Sfax, even international wire services. By the next morning, journalists descended on Nabil like vultures sensing carrion. The Medina became a circus. Television cameras lined the narrow streets. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk. Customers who'd bought from Demirji, neighbors who'd lived near his shop, former employees who'd worked brief stints before quitting for reasons they couldn't articulate at the time but now seemed horrifyingly clear. He was always so quiet. One woman told a French television crew, "So professional. How could we have known?" This question echoed everywhere. How could they have known? The answer was simple and terrible. They couldn't, because Demirji had been perfect. Not flashy, not memorable, not suspicious. He'd hidden in the most effective way possible, by being completely ordinary. Demirji himself refused to speak initially. Detained in Nablus police station, he sat in silence while investigators documented evidence, photographed the scene, cataloged the remains. His expression never changed. No remorse, no defiance, nothing. Just the blank face of a man whose mask had been removed, but who couldn't remember how to wear his real face anymore. The psychiatric evaluation came quickly. Dr. Karim Zouari, Tunisia's most prominent forensic psychiatrist, was brought from Tunis to assess the butcher. Their first session lasted 6 hours. Zouari emerged looking pale, shaken, older than when he'd entered. "What did he say?" investigators demanded. Zouari lit a cigarette with trembling hands. He talked about efficiency, about business models, about supply chains. The psychiatrist paused, smoke curling around his face. He doesn't understand why everyone's upset. To him, this is no different than running any other business. Is he insane? Legally? No. He understands right from wrong in the abstract. But his moral compass. Zouari trailed off, searching for words. It doesn't point north. Points somewhere else entirely. Somewhere I don't think we have maps for. The investigation uncovered layers of horror that grew worse with each revelation. The notebooks Demirji kept weren't just records, they were case studies. For each victim, he documented selection criteria, method of capture, processing timeline, disposal techniques, even customer feedback for the resulting product. One entry, dated March 1975, corresponded with Fatima Garbai's disappearance. Subject acquired Thursday evening. Female, approximately 60 kilograms, good muscle tone. Processed Friday. Yield satisfactory. Approximately 40 kilograms usable product. Customers reported excellent quality, particularly the tenderloin cuts. Consider targeting similar demographic in future. This clinical language, this reduction of human beings to yield percentages and quality assessments, was somehow more disturbing than any violent rage would have been. It suggested a mind that had completely divorced humanity from humans, that saw people as nothing more than organic material to be harvested. But perhaps most disturbing was what investigators found in Demirji's home. A modest apartment 3 blocks from his shop, the space was meticulously organized. Books about anatomy lined the shelves, medical textbooks, butchering guides, veterinary manuals. Photographs covered one wall. Family members, some dating back decades. In these images, Demirji appeared normal, smiling at weddings, playing with nieces and nephews, standing beside his father, both men wearing bloody aprons, both grinning with what looked like genuine pride. This normality was suffocating. Investigators wanted a monster, something they could identify, categorize, separate from themselves. Instead, they found a man who'd lived a double life so seamlessly that the boundaries between his two selves had become invisible even to him. The trial began in October 1978, held in a courthouse in Tunis because Nablus facilities couldn't accommodate the crowds. Security was unprecedented. Death threats had poured in from across Tunisia and beyond. Families of victims demanded justice. Religious leaders called for execution. International human rights organizations urged careful deliberation. The government, acutely aware that the world was watching, worked to ensure the proceedings appeared fair, legitimate, beyond reproach. Demirji was led into court wearing a plain gray suit, hands cuffed, flanked by 4 armed guards. The courtroom fell silent. Every eye fixed on him, searching for signs of the monster they knew existed beneath that ordinary exterior. He looked back at them with the same blank expression he'd worn for weeks. Empty, absent, as though the person had already left and only the body remained. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Physical evidence filled multiple warehouses. Bones, tools, notebooks, photographs, testimonies from horrified customers who'd kept receipts from purchases made at Demergy's shop. DNA testing, still relatively new, confirmed that remains found in the shop matched missing persons. 14 victims were definitively identified. 5 more remained unidentified, their bones speaking to crimes that predated Demergy's detailed record-keeping. The prosecution painted Demergy as a calculated predator who'd systematically murdered and cannibalized victims over nearly a decade. They presented evidence of premeditation, of careful planning, of a sophisticated operation designed to avoid detection. They called psychiatrists who testified about antisocial personality disorder, about psychopathy, about minds that functioned without empathy or conscience. The defense was minimal. Demergy's court-appointed attorney, a young man who'd drawn the short straw in his firm, argued diminished capacity, suggesting his client's complete lack of remorse indicated insanity. But the argument fell flat. Demergy was clearly functional. He ran a business, maintained relationships, navigated society. He simply chose to do monstrous things. The most devastating moment came when families testified. One by one, they took the stand, describing loved ones who'd disappeared. Mothers spoke about daughters who'd never come home. Husbands described wives who'd vanished. Children, now orphans, clutched photographs of parents they'd never see again. Through all of it, Demergy showed nothing. No reaction, no remorse, no acknowledgement that these testimonies described real people, real suffering, real consequences of his actions. Finally, the judge asked if Demergy wished to make a statement. His attorney advised silence, but Demergy surprised everyone by nodding. He stood, hands still cuffed, and addressed the court. His voice was quiet, even unnervingly calm. "I don't expect understanding," he began. "Most people can't see past their conditioning, their sentimentality about what makes something human versus animal. I learned long ago that these distinctions are arbitrary. Meat is meat. A body is just components. Some components are useful, others aren't. I simply maximized utility while minimizing waste." The courtroom erupted. Shouts, curses. Someone threw a shoe that bounced off the defendant's table. Judges demanded order. Guards moved to restrain Demergy, though he hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the chaos he'd triggered. When silence was finally restored, he continued. "I served my community for over 30 years. I provided quality products at fair prices. The source of those products was efficient, sustainable, solved several problems simultaneously. That people feel disgust is understandable, conditioning again. But disgust isn't a moral argument. It's just an emotional response." "You murdered 19 people," the prosecutor shouted. "I processed 19 units of organic material," Demergy corrected. "The distinction you make is cultural, not objective. In some societies, eating pork is taboo. In others, beef is sacred. In mine, human flesh carries stigma. But objectively, these are just different proteins with different social meanings attached." The judge interrupted, forbidding further statements. But the damage was done. Demergy had revealed himself fully, and what lay beneath the mask was worse than any monster. It was a void, an absence of everything that makes humans human: empathy, conscience, recognition of others' inherent worth. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on 19 counts of first-degree murder, guilty of desecration of corpses, guilty of running an illegal food operation. The sentence: death by hanging, to be carried out after all appeals were exhausted. Demergy accepted the verdict without reaction. He was led from the courtroom the same way he'd entered, blank-faced, silent, a walking void in a gray suit. But the trial's end wasn't the story's end. because now came a question that authorities hadn't fully considered: what to do about the customers. Investigators had recovered sales records from Demirji's shop. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of people who'd purchased products that likely, possibly, almost certainly contained human remains. Should they be notified? Should they be tested for prion diseases? Should they face charges as unwitting accomplices? The government decided on silence. Informing customers would cause mass panic, psychological trauma, potential public health crisis. Better to quietly monitor them, to watch for signs of disease, to hope that most of what Demirji sold was actually animal meat and only a fraction was human. This decision haunts Tunisia to this day, because somewhere in Nabil, perhaps across Tunisia, people who once shopped at a quiet butcher shop carry a terrible possibility. That they consumed neighbors, friends, family members. That they praised the quality of meat that came from their own community. That they fed their children something unspeakable. Some customers, suspecting the truth, sought psychiatric help. They reported nightmares, compulsive behaviors, and inability to eat meat. Therapists were sworn to secrecy but noted common themes in these patients: guilt, contamination fears, breakdown of trust in basic social structures. If a butcher could be a monster, if community pillars could be predators, if normal transactions could mask atrocities, then what else was hidden? What other horrors lurked behind ordinary facades? The psychological impact rippled outward like shock waves from an earthquake. Parents questioned whether their children were safe at schools, at mosques, at neighbors' homes. People stopped shopping at small vendors, preferring larger, more transparent operations. The social fabric of Nabil, woven tight by centuries of interconnection, began to fray. Meanwhile, Demirji sat in his cell, awaiting execution. Guards reported that he spent most days reading medical texts, philosophy, books on industrial agriculture. He ate prison food without complaint, slept soundly, exercised in the yard with mechanical regularity. The other prisoners avoided him, not from fear exactly, but from instinctive revulsion. Even hardened criminals, thieves, violent offenders, men who'd committed terrible acts, recognized something fundamentally wrong about the quiet butcher. Dr. Zouari continued visiting, fascinated despite his horror. "Why did you keep such detailed records?" he asked during one session. "You must have known they'd incriminate you if discovered." Demirji considered the question. "Professional pride," he finally answered. "Any craft worth doing is worth documenting. My father taught me that. Keep records, track improvements, refine techniques. How else do you achieve excellence? But you were murdering people. I was perfecting a process." Demirji's tone suggested he was explaining something obvious to a slow child. The moral dimension you assign is external to the work itself. A surgeon removes organs. A butcher processes meat. I did both. The fact that society disapproves is irrelevant to the quality of the work. These conversations left Zouari deeply unsettled. He'd studied psychopathy for decades, interviewed hundreds of violent offenders. But Demirji was different. Most criminals exhibited some self-awareness, some recognition, however twisted, of societal norms they'd violated. Demirji seemed genuinely unable to comprehend why anyone objected to his activities. It wasn't defiance or rationalization. It was complete moral blindness, a condition Zouari struggled to classify within existing psychiatric frameworks. "He's not insane in any clinical sense," Zouari reported to the court during appeal proceedings. "He understands reality, cause and effect, social expectations. But his value system is inverted isn't the right word. Absent is more accurate. He operates without the fundamental assumptions that underlie human society." The appeals process dragged for 2 years. Demirji's attorney argued procedural errors, inadequate representation, the need for more extensive psychiatric evaluation. International human rights groups opposed capital punishment on principle. The Tunisian government, eager to demonstrate its commitment to justice while avoiding international criticism, allowed the appeals to proceed. During this time, more victims were identified. Forensic anthropologists painstakingly reconstructed identities from partial remains. 23 confirmed victims eventually. perhaps more. Some bones were too degraded for identification, and Demirji's early crimes predated his obsessive record-keeping. Each identification brought fresh anguish to families who'd spent years in limbo. Closure, they discovered, was a myth. Knowing was somehow worse than not knowing. The imagination, horrible as it was, couldn't match the documented reality of what Demirji had done. Families learned not just that loved ones were dead, but how they died, how they'd been processed, where they'd ended up. This knowledge was a poison that spread through family trees, contaminating marriages, relationships, mental health. One widow, upon learning her husband had been dismembered and sold as lamb cutlets, suffered a complete psychotic break. She spent the rest of her life institutionalized, convinced she was being eaten from the inside by meat that wouldn't digest. Her children were orphaned twice, once by murder, once by madness. This was Demirji's true body count. Not just the direct victims, but the cascade of destruction rippling outward through time. Families destroyed, communities traumatized, trust evaporated. The invisible bonds that hold societies together, severed by one man's systematic predation. In August 1980, the Tunisian Supreme Court rejected Demirji's final appeal. The execution was scheduled for September 15th. The method would be hanging, carried out at dawn in the courtyard of Tunis Central Prison. Per Islamic law, Demirji was offered the opportunity to make peace with Allah, to confess his sins and seek forgiveness. He declined. "I have nothing to confess," he told the imam who visited his cell. "I violated social conventions, not divine law. Show me where the Quran specifically prohibits eating human flesh." The imam tried explaining concepts of sanctity, dignity, the special status of human life. Demirji listened politely, then shook his head. "You're describing feelings, not facts. Cultural norms, not universal truths. I reject the premise of your argument." On the night before his execution, Demirji was granted a final meal. He requested lamb chops, cooked medium rare with mint sauce. The irony wasn't lost on prison officials, who debated whether to fulfill the request. Ultimately, they did. Denial seemed petty, and Demirji would be dead in hours anyway. He ate alone in his cell, savoring each bite with apparent enjoyment. Guards watching through the cell door window reported that he seemed more animated than they'd ever seen him. He chewed slowly, deliberately, as though conducting a final evaluation of quality and preparation. When he finished, he set down his fork with precision, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and sat back with something approaching satisfaction. "Excellent," he said to no one in particular. "Really excellent quality. Good marbling, proper cooking temperature, seasoning balanced perfectly. This is how meat should be served." The guards looked at each other, deeply disturbed. Even now, hours from death, Demirji was evaluating meat like a critic reviewing a restaurant. The man simply could not be reached, could not be reformed, could not be made to understand the enormity of his crimes. That night, Demirji slept soundly. No nightmares, no anxiety. When guards woke him at 4 a.m., he rose immediately, dressed in the clothes provided, simple white garments traditional for execution, and followed them without resistance. The walk to the courtyard took 5 minutes. Demirji moved with steady steps, showing no fear, no remorse, no emotion whatsoever. The scaffold had been constructed according to precise specifications, height calculated to ensure instant death rather than slow strangulation. Tunisia wasn't cruel. Even monsters received mercy. A small crowd had gathered, officials, witnesses required by law, a few journalists admitted under strict conditions. No family members of victims were allowed. Authorities feared violence. The pre-dawn darkness pressed close, broken only by harsh spotlights that turned the courtyard into a stage for death. The executioner, a professional brought from Morocco for the task, checked the rope, tested the trapdoor mechanism, ensured everything would function properly. He was methodical, professional, taking pride in his craft much as Demirji had taken pride in his. Demirji was led to the platform. The executioner asked if he had final words. For the first time in 2 years, Demirji smiled. Not the empty expression he'd worn in court, but something genuine, something that seemed almost human. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "I have one observation." Everyone waited. This was the moment for confession, for apology, for acknowledgement of crimes. Even now, some hoped for a crack in the armor, proof that humanity existed somewhere deep inside this man. Demirji looked directly at the gathered witnesses. "We're all meat," he said simply. "Every person here, meat walking around, pretending to be something more. You judge me for recognizing this truth, but that doesn't make it less true. In the end, we're all just protein waiting to return to the earth. I simply accelerated the process." Then he nodded to the executioner. "I'm ready. Do your work." The hood was placed over his head, the noose positioned around his neck. The executioner stepped back, hand on the lever that would release the trapdoor. In the moment before dawn, in the stillness before the act, someone in the crowd whispered a prayer. The words drifted across the courtyard, ancient syllables seeking mercy for the damned. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor opened. Nasser Demirji dropped into darkness. The fall was calculated precisely, enough to break the neck instantly, ensuring quick death. The body twitched once, twice, then hung still. A doctor stepped forward, checked for vital signs, pronounced death at 5:47 a.m. The butcher of Nabil was gone, but his victims remained. Not just those he'd killed, but those he'd unknowingly made into accomplices. Not just the families of the dead, but the entire community he'd contaminated with his darkness. As dawn light crept across the prison courtyard, illuminating the hanging body, someone asked the question that had haunted everyone throughout the trial. What do we do with him? Where does he go? Traditional burial in a Muslim cemetery was denied. Religious authorities refused to consecrate ground with his presence. Cremation was considered, but that violated Islamic law. Finally, a decision was made. Unmarked burial in a remote location, coordinates kept secret, no stone to mark the spot. Demirji's body was transported in an unmarked van to somewhere in the Tunisian desert. A hole was dug. The body was lowered. Earth was shoveled over it. No ceremony. No witnesses beyond the burial crew. Just a return to dust in an anonymous location where no one would ever visit, ever mourn, ever remember. Or so they hoped, because some stories don't end with death. Some horrors embed themselves so deeply in collective memory that they become immortal. The butcher of Nabil would haunt Tunisia for generations. A cautionary tale, a nightmare made real, a reminder that monsters don't announce themselves. They blend in, they smile, they serve you meat at good prices and ask about your family. And sometimes, on quiet nights in Nabil, when the Mediterranean wind whistles through the Medina's narrow streets, old-timers swear they can still smell it. That chemical sweet scent that used to drift from the butcher shop. That smell that meant death hiding behind ordinary business. The shop itself was demolished within months of Demirji's execution. The space remained vacant for years. No one would rent it, no business would occupy it. Eventually, it was converted into a parking area, the ground covered with concrete, as though enough weight could press the memories into oblivion. But memories don't die that easily. And in Nabil, in hushed conversations over mint tea, in warnings whispered to curious children, the story of Nasser Demirji persists. A reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it wears an apron and asks how thick you'd like your cutlets sliced. Sometimes the monster is just a man, and that's the most terrifying thing of all. The execution of Nasser Demirji should have been the end. In any logical narrative, the villain dies and the story concludes. But real life follows no such script. Real horror doesn't end with the monster's death. It metastasizes, spreading through communities like cancer through bone. Tunisia in the early 1980s was a nation attempting modernization while clinging to tradition. President Habib Bourguiba pushed secular reforms, women's rights, education, economic development. The country wanted to be seen as progressive, enlightened, a bridge between Arab and European worlds. Then came Demirji, a living nightmare that undermined every claim of civilization Tunisia had made. International press coverage was brutal. Headlines in France, Italy, Across Europe screamed variations of Cannibal Butcher and The Monster of Tunisia. Sensationalist accounts exaggerated details, invented lurid specifics, transformed a horrific reality into entertainment for readers who'd never visit Nablus, never understand the trauma rippling through the community. Tourism, critical to Tunisia's economy, plummeted. Who wanted to vacation in the country where a butcher had served human meat to unsuspecting customers? Resort bookings in Hammamet and Sousse dropped by 40%. Restaurants struggled as visitors questioned every meal. The damage to Tunisia's international reputation took decades to repair. But the real devastation was local, personal, impossible to quantify through economic statistics. Consider Amina Khaled, a woman in her 30s who'd shopped regularly at Demirji's store. She'd bought meat for her family every week for over 5 years. Lamb for couscous, beef for tagines, various cuts for different dishes. She'd praised Demirji's quality, recommended his shop to friends, fed his products to her children. When the truth emerged, Amina's world collapsed. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The thought that she might have fed her family human flesh destroyed something fundamental in her psyche. She'd been a good mother. That was her identity, her purpose, her pride. Now that identity was contaminated by an unknowable possibility. She visited Dr. Hassan Benani, a psychiatrist in Tunis who'd begun specializing in what he termed Demirji trauma syndrome. Dozens of former customers exhibited similar symptoms: obsessive thoughts, contamination fears, inability to trust food, night terrors featuring the butcher shop, compulsive hand-washing, eating disorders. "I can't feed my children anymore," Amina told Dr. Benani during their first session. "What if I choose wrong? What if something is contaminated? What if I'm poisoning them without knowing?" "The meat you're buying now is safe," Benani reassured her. "Demirji is dead. His shop is destroyed. You're not in danger." "But how do I know?" Amina's voice rose to a desperate pitch. "I thought his meat was safe. Everyone did. If we were wrong then, why should I trust my judgment now?" This was the psychological trap dozens found themselves in. Demirji had proven that reality could be horrifically different from appearance. If a respected butcher was actually a serial killer, if normal transactions masked cannibalism, if community trust was so misplaced, then how could anyone trust anything ever again? Some victims recovered with therapy. Others never did. Amina eventually moved her family to Tunis, trying to escape the contaminated geography of Nablus. But the trauma followed. Her marriage disintegrated. Her husband couldn't handle her paranoia, her compulsive behaviors, her transformation from confident mother to frightened wreck. Her children grew up watching their mother destroyed by something they were too young to fully understand. This pattern repeated throughout Nablus. Marriages failed. Businesses closed. People moved away, seeking fresh starts in places where they weren't known as those people who might have eaten human flesh. The community hemorrhaged population, especially among younger residents who saw no future in a town forever branded by Demirji's crimes. The Medina where Demirji's shop had stood became a tourist attraction of the macabre. Despite local opposition, visitors began seeking out the location, taking photographs, treating tragedy as entertainment. Tour guides, unauthorized, entrepreneurial, offered Butcher of Nablus walking tours, pointing out relevant locations and embellishing stories with invented details. "Right here is where he killed them," one guide would claim, gesturing to a random building. "And over there, that's where he stored the bodies." None of it was true, but truth mattered less than the thrill of proximity to evil. Local authorities tried to stop these tours, but enforcement was difficult. The guides simply operated more quietly, advertising through word of mouth rather than signs. Dark tourism had discovered Nablus, and no amount of official disapproval could stop people's fascination with horror. Meanwhile, forensic investigation continued even after Demirji's execution. Dr. Leila Mansouri, Tunisia's chief forensic anthropologist, spent years analyzing the remains recovered from the butcher shop. Her task was identifying victims and determining what had happened to them, a gruesome puzzle with pieces made from human bones. The work took a psychological toll. Dr. Mansouri began having nightmares where bones spoke to her, pleading for identification, for proper burial, for justice. She developed a ritual of saying a prayer over each skeleton before beginning analysis. Not for religious reasons, but to maintain some connection to the humanity these remains represented. "I have to remember these were people," she explained to a colleague. "Not specimens, not evidence. People with families, dreams, futures Demirji stole. If I forget that, I become like him, reducing humans to components, to problems to be processed." Her work eventually identified 23 victims definitively. DNA analysis, cutting-edge technology in the early 1980s, matched bones to missing persons reports. Each identification brought closure to one family and reopened wounds for another. The process was agonizing, necessary, and insufficient all at once. But 5 sets of remains defied identification. No DNA matches, no corresponding missing persons reports. These victims had been so thoroughly erased from society that even death couldn't restore their names. Dr. Mansouri gave them designations, victim X1 through X5, but privately thought of them as the forgotten ones. People so marginal that their disappearances hadn't even been noticed. These unidentified victims haunted investigators more than the others, because their anonymity suggested something worse than murder, the possibility that people could vanish completely, that society's safety nets had gaps large enough for human beings to fall through never to be found. Dr. Mansouri eventually arranged for burial of the unidentified remains in a small cemetery outside Nabil. A single stone marked the shared grave, "Unknown victims of Nasser Demirji. May they find peace." The ceremony was private, attended only by investigators and a handful of clergy. No press, no spectacle, just respect for the dead who had no one else to mourn them. As years passed, Demirji's crimes faded from international consciousness but remained burned into Tunisian memory. The case became a touchstone, referenced whenever discussions turned to evil, to hidden dangers, to the fragility of social trust. Criminologists studied Demirji extensively. How had he avoided detection so long? What warning signs had been missed? Could similar predators be operating elsewhere, hiding in plain sight? The answers were disturbing. Demirji succeeded because he targeted carefully, moved slowly, and exploited societal blind spots. He preyed on people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger intensive investigation. The marginal, the mobile, the forgotten. He operated in a profession where blood, meat, and death were normalized. He maintained a facade of absolute normalcy, never drawing attention, never displaying the behavioral red flags that often mark serial killers. Demirji represents a worst-case scenario, criminologist Dr. Omar Trabelsi wrote in his influential study of the case. He combined intelligence, patience, access to victims, a profession that provided cover, and complete absence of conscience. Most serial killers possess some of these traits. Demirji possessed all of them. That's what made him so successful and so difficult to catch. The case prompted changes in Tunisian law enforcement. Missing persons investigations received more resources. Businesses handling meat faced stricter inspections. Anonymous tip lines were established. But these measures, while necessary, couldn't undo the damage already done or guarantee such crimes wouldn't happen again. Because the hardest truth about Demirji was this: he wasn't supernatural. He wasn't gifted with special abilities. He was simply a careful predator operating in an environment where care and patience were sufficient to enable years of murder. The machinery of society, law enforcement, community vigilance, regulatory oversight, had failed completely, and there was no guarantee it wouldn't fail again. This realization sparked what Dr. Benani called the paranoia years. In the mid-1980s, Tunisian society became hypervigilant, suspicious of anyone in positions where they could harm others. Butchers faced particular scrutiny. Customers demanded to see where meat came from, how it was stored, entire carcasses to verify they were animals, not humans. The profession, already stigmatized by association with Demirji, became nearly impossible to practice. Many butchers changed careers. Others moved to different regions where the stigma was less intense. Some organized, forming professional associations to combat negative perceptions and implement quality controls that demonstrated their legitimacy. The Association of Tunisian Butchers lobbied for standardized certification, surprise inspections, and public transparency about supply chains. These efforts helped slowly, but decades later, older Tunisians still hesitated before buying meat, still wondered if the friendly butcher might hide darkness, still carried Demirji's shadow with them to markets and shops. The psychological impact extended beyond direct victims and customers. An entire generation of Tunisian children grew up hearing Demirji's name invoked as warning and threat. Behave or the butcher will get you replaced traditional bogeymen. The line between cautionary tale and trauma was dangerously thin, and many children developed anxieties that persisted into adulthood. My daughter is 30 years old and still won't eat meat. One parent told researchers studying long-term impacts of the case. She was 6 when Demirji was caught. She didn't understand details, but she absorbed the fear, the horror in adults' voices. It shaped her permanently. This intergenerational transmission of trauma was one of Demirji's most insidious legacies. He didn't just harm his direct victims. He contaminated an entire community's collective psyche, creating ripples that spread through time, touching people who weren't even alive during his killing spree. Dr. Benani, after decades of treating Demirji-related trauma, reflected on the case's broader implications. Demirji proved something philosophers and theologians have debated for centuries: that evil doesn't require supernatural explanation. It requires only absence of empathy, of conscience, of recognition that others possess intrinsic value. That absence is more terrifying than any demon because it can exist in anyone, can hide behind any face, any profession, any normal life. We want evil to be obvious, monstrous, easily identified. Demirji showed us it isn't. The butcher's shop location remained cursed ground. Even after conversion to parking, businesses adjacent to the spot struggled. The fabric merchant who'd complained about the smell closed his shop in 1982, unable to recover lost customers. A cafe that opened briefly in the space went bankrupt within months. Patrons found the location unbearable despite renovations that removed every trace of the original structure. Eventually, the entire building was demolished and replaced with a small park. No plaque marked what had happened there. No memorial acknowledged the victims. The decision was deliberate. Nabil wanted to move forward, not enshrine its darkest chapter in public space. But forgetting proved impossible. The park, despite pleasant landscaping and children's play equipment, remained underutilized. Parents unconsciously avoided it, finding excuses to take their children elsewhere. The ground itself seemed tainted, as though soil could absorb evil and radiate it back to the surface. On the 40th anniversary of Demirji's execution in 2020, a journalist visiting Nabil asked elderly residents about the case. Most refused to discuss it. One old man, who'd been a young police officer during the investigation, finally agreed to speak. "You want to understand Demirji?" he said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You can't. I spent months investigating that shop, documenting evidence, interviewing witnesses. I saw things I'll never forget, and I still don't understand. How does someone become that? How does a human being lose everything that makes them human but continue functioning in society?" He took a long drag, exhaled smoke into the Mediterranean breeze. "We caught him. We executed him. We destroyed his shop. But we didn't win, because he proved something we can't unprove. That monsters are real, that they look like us, that any normal person you pass on the street might be a predator. That's what he took from us. Not just 23 lives, but our certainty that we could trust our own judgment about people." This sentiment echoed throughout the community. Demirji's greatest crime wasn't murder. It was erosion of trust, the fundamental social glue that allows communities to function. After Demirji, Nabil became a city of strangers, people living alongside each other but unable to truly connect, always wondering what darkness might hide behind friendly facades. The butcher was long dead. His victims were buried. His shop was demolished. But his legacy endured, a wound that never fully healed, a scar tissue that remained tender decades later. Some wounds don't heal. Some horrors don't fade. Some names, once spoken, echo forever through the streets where they committed their crimes. Nasser Demirji, the butcher of Nabil, a man who proved that evil doesn't announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it wears an apron, smiles politely, and asks if you'd like your meat wrapped in paper or plastic. And that quiet, ordinary evil is the most terrifying thing of all. Because if it happened once in one shop in one city, how many other ordinary places hide extraordinary horrors? How many friendly faces mask predatory minds? How many communities live alongside monsters they haven't discovered yet? These questions have no comfortable answers. They keep people awake at night. They transform simple acts like buying groceries into exercises in vigilance. They remind us that civilization is thinner than we'd like to believe, that barbarism lurks just beneath the surface, waiting for the right person to strip away the veneer. Nasser Demirji stripped that veneer. And Tunisia, like every society that discovers a monster in its midst, had to decide whether to rebuild the comfortable illusions or live with the uncomfortable truth. Most chose illusion, because truth in this case was unbearable. But some remember. Some carry the knowledge like a weight they can never put down. Some understand that the real horror of the Butcher of Nabil wasn't the murders themselves, but what they revealed about the fragility of everything we take for granted. Trust, safety, community, humanity itself. All of it can be stripped away by one person, one shop, one patient predator who understands that the best hiding place is in plain sight. The Butcher of Nabil is gone. But his lesson remains, carved into the collective memory of a community that learned too late that monsters are real, and they serve you meat at good prices. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Stoneman Murders. They called him a phantom, but phantoms don't crush skulls while you dream. 12 rocks, 12 heads, one city that learned to fear the dark. We're diving into the shadows of a killer who turned sleep into a death sentence. A predator who chose the defenseless, the forgotten, the homeless souls curled up on cold pavements. While Mumbai dreamed behind locked doors, something monstrous crept through the darkness with a boulder in its hands. This is the hunt for the Stoneman, a faceless horror who proved that the most terrifying monsters don't hide under beds. They wait until you're lying on the street with nowhere to run. Mumbai, 1985. The city breathed with the rhythm of survival, a metropolis where millions fought for space, for air, for the next meal. The streets never truly slept. Even at 3 in the morning, the arteries of this urban beast pulsed with life. Taxi drivers hunting fares, night watchmen stationed at shop fronts, and thousands upon thousands sleeping rough on the pavements. These weren't just statistics, they were human beings. Families who'd migrated from villages with dreams of Bollywood salaries and city opportunities, only to find themselves crushed by rent they couldn't afford. Day laborers who spent their wages feeding children and sending money home, leaving nothing for a roof over their heads. Old men whose families had forgotten them. Young men still believing tomorrow would be different. They slept on newspapers spread across concrete. They slept with their belongings clutched tight. They slept in clusters for safety, or alone in doorways when no other choice remained. And they slept deeply, the kind of exhausted, total sleep that comes from bodies worked past their limits. The killer understood this. He'd been watching. June 1985. The monsoon season approached, bringing with it humid nights that made clothing stick to skin and turned the air thick enough to taste. On one such night, in the Shaun area of Mumbai, something unthinkable happened. A pavement dweller, a man whose name we'll never know because nobody claimed his body, lay sleeping near a shuttered shop. His head rested on a bundled cloth. His chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Around him, the street sprawled with other sleeping forms, a horizontal city of the dispossessed. Somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, when even Mumbai's relentless energy dipped to its lowest ebb, a figure approached. Silent, deliberate, carrying a rock that required both hands to lift. A crude boulder, heavy enough to feel its weight pull at the shoulders, large enough to eclipse a human skull. The figure stood over the sleeping man. No words, no hesitation, just the swift, brutal elevation of stone above head. And then, the sound was wrong. It wasn't loud like a gunshot or clean like a knife. It was a wet, dense impact, the kind of sound that speaks of bones breaking, of structures collapsing inward. The kind of sound that once heard brands itself into memory. The man's body jerked once, violently, then went completely still. Blood began spreading across the pavement, dark as oil in the weak streetlight. The killer dropped the rock beside the body and vanished into Mumbai's maze of alleys. When morning broke and the city stirred back to life, shopkeepers opening their shutters made the discovery. The police were called. The body was photographed, documented, removed. The pavement was hosed down, the rock taken as evidence, and life continued. Because here's the terrible truth. In a city where thousands die every week from disease, accidents, and poverty, one dead homeless man barely registered. The police filed their report. Some officers theorized it was gang-related. Others suggested a personal dispute, perhaps over territory, begging rights, or some petty insult. Nobody used the word serial killer. That would have been absurd. Why would anyone systematically target the homeless? There was no money to steal. These people owned nothing worth taking. There was no sexual motive. The body showed no signs of assault beyond the catastrophic head trauma. Revenge? Against someone with no power, no enemies beyond other desperate souls fighting for the same scraps? The case went cold before it even got warm. But the killer wasn't finished. He'd tasted something in that first murder. Perhaps power, perhaps purpose, perhaps just the dark thrill of destroying life. Whatever it was, it demanded repetition. 2 weeks later, another body. Same method, massive head trauma from a heavy rock. Same victim profile. Homeless man, sleeping rough, discovered at dawn. Different location, different neighborhood, but the signature was identical if anyone had been looking for a signature. They weren't. The Mumbai Police Department was, and remains, one of the most overwhelmed law enforcement agencies on the planet. With a city of millions and resources spread impossibly thin, they triaged crimes by solvability and public pressure. Dead homeless men generated neither. No families came forward demanding justice. No newspapers ran front-page stories. No politicians called for task forces. The killer had chosen his victims with savage genius. He'd identified the invisible people, those whom society had already decided didn't matter. And he was right. Murder after murder, the bodies piled up, and Mumbai barely noticed. By September 1985, 6 people were dead. 6 human beings, each with their own stories, their own reasons for ending up on those streets, each with hopes that had somehow survived the grinding poverty until a rock ended them. 6 families somewhere who might have wondered why letters stopped coming, or who'd long since stopped expecting any contact. The rocks varied. Sometimes rough-hewn chunks of masonry from construction sites. Sometimes smooth river stones. Once, a piece of broken concrete with rusted rebar still attached. But always large enough, always heavy enough to kill with a single blow. The targeting was precise. The killer never chose groups sleeping together, too much risk of one waking, of intervention. He selected isolated victims or those sleeping on the periphery of clusters. He struck during that darkest window between late-night drunks stumbling home and early morning laborers heading to work. He never returned to the same location twice in succession. And still, nobody connected the murders. Forensics in 1985 Mumbai couldn't offer much help. DNA analysis was years away from routine use. The rocks, being picked up from various locations, carried no traceable evidence. The killer left no fingerprints, no fibers, no witnesses. Just shattered skulls and questions nobody was asking. The victims were typically discovered hours after death, bodies already cooling, blood already congealed. Shop owners would arrive to open their businesses and find a corpse outside. Sometimes they'd step over it, assuming the person was merely sleeping, until the unnatural angle of the head or the pool of blood registered. The police dutifully documented each case. Different officers responded to different scenes at different stations across the city. The reports went into different filing systems. In an era before computerized databases, before centralized crime analysis, the pattern remained invisible, scattered fragments of the same horror story, filed in separate drawers across separate stations. But patterns have a way of emerging, even through institutional blindness. By late 1985, a few detectives began noticing similarities. The method, the victim profile, the timing. Conversations happened in station break rooms, informal sharing of case details. Slowly, reluctantly, a terrible recognition began forming. Mumbai had a serial killer, one who'd already murdered at least 6 people, one who showed no signs of stopping. And the most terrifying part? He'd been operating for months in plain sight, selecting victims from the most vulnerable population, killing them in public spaces, and nobody had raised an alarm. The city was about to wake up to a nightmare it had been sleeping through. But by the time the police officially acknowledged the pattern, by the time the media picked up the story, by the time public fear began to build, the Stoneman had already perfected his method. And he was just getting started. When the newspapers finally broke the story in late 1985, panic spread through Mumbai like monsoon floodwater. Fast, chaotic, and impossible to contain. The headlines screamed variations of the same horror. Serial killer stalks Mumbai streets. Stoneman terror grips city. Pavement dwellers murdered in sleep. Suddenly, those 6 dead homeless men were no longer isolated incidents filed away and forgotten. They were chapters in an ongoing nightmare. The public reaction split along Mumbai's brutal class divide. For the wealthy and middle-class citizens sleeping in apartments behind locked doors, the Stoneman became a grim curiosity, something to discuss over morning chai, to debate in office break rooms, to nervously joke about. They weren't sleeping on pavements. They weren't the target. Their fear was abstract, vicarious. But for Mumbai's homeless population, estimated at anywhere from 40,000 to over 100,000 souls, the terror was immediate and absolute. Sleep, that basic human need, had transformed into a death sentence. Every night became a calculated risk. Every closed eye an invitation to murder. The pavement communities adapted with desperate ingenuity. People who'd previously slept alone now clustered in groups, believing safety existed in numbers. They were wrong. The killer simply waited for someone to drift away from the pack. Some homeless individuals began staying awake through the night, volunteering as lookouts for their sleeping companions, then sleeping during daylight hours. But exhaustion is a biological imperative. Eventually, vigilance fails. Eyes close, sleep comes, and vulnerability returns. Others tried abandoning the pavements entirely, moving to public parks, railway platforms, or construction sites, anywhere that wasn't a street. This merely scattered the potential victim pool across a wider area, making police protection even more impossible. The Mumbai police, now under intense public and political pressure, scrambled to respond. They increased patrols in areas where previous attacks had occurred. They stationed officers on streets with high concentrations of homeless sleepers. They conducted sweeps, questioning suspicious individuals, investigating anyone with a history of violence. It was all spectacularly ineffective, because the killer wasn't operating on a predictable schedule or in a confined area. Mumbai sprawls across 438 square kilometers of dense urban landscape. The Stoneman could strike anywhere, anytime, then disappear into a city of millions. The police couldn't guard every pavement. They couldn't protect every vulnerable person. And they had virtually nothing to work with, no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the rocks themselves, no coherent profile. What kind of person does this? That question haunted investigators and armchair detectives alike. The murders showed no pattern beyond the method and victim selection. No sexual assault, no robbery, no apparent personal connection between killer and victims, just pure, inexplicable violence. Criminal psychologists consulted by the police suggested various theories. Some believed the killer harbored pathological hatred toward the homeless. Perhaps he'd been homeless himself once, and now projected his self-loathing onto others. Others theorized he was enacting some twisted form of social cleansing, eliminating those he viewed as undesirable. A few suggested the killings might be ritualistic, the rocks holding symbolic significance. All the theories shared one chilling commonality: the killer would continue until stopped. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was systematic, compulsive, the behavior of someone whose internal wiring had catastrophically failed, leaving only the need to crush and destroy. January 1986 brought 3 more murders in quick succession. The killer seemed energized by the media attention, or perhaps he was simply accelerating toward whatever dark conclusion his damaged mind envisioned. Each new death tightened the city's collective anxiety. The press coverage intensified, taking on a sensationalistic edge that modern audiences would recognize. Dramatic headlines, speculation presented as fact, armchair profiling of the killer's psychology. The name Stoneman became permanent, a brand of terror as recognizable to Mumbakers as any celebrity. This media frenzy created a secondary crisis. False reports flooded police stations. Every violent death, every homeless person found deceased, every suspicious person seen near sleeping areas was reported as a Stoneman incident. The police had to investigate each claim, diverting resources from legitimate leads. The signal-to-noise ratio became catastrophically skewed. Meanwhile, the actual killer continued operating with disturbing efficiency. He seemed to understand Mumbai's rhythms better than the police pursuing him. He knew which alleys offered quick escape routes. He knew the timing of police patrols, soon adjusted his schedule to avoid them. He knew Mumbai's homeless population moved seasonally, following construction jobs and weather patterns, and he adjusted his hunting grounds accordingly. The police tried various tactics. They distributed pamphlets to homeless communities with safety tips. They set up phone hotlines for tips and information. They even attempted undercover operations. Police officers dressed as homeless people, sleeping on pavements while backup teams watched from hiding. These decoy operations failed utterly. Whether through luck or some predatory instinct, the killer never approached an undercover officer. He seemed capable of identifying vulnerability with uncanny accuracy, distinguishing between a truly defenseless victim and a trap. One promising lead emerged in March 1986. A night watchman reported seeing a man carrying a large rock near a pavement area at approximately 2:30 a.m. The witness provided a description: medium height, medium build, age somewhere between 25 and 45. The description was uselessly generic. It matched roughly 1 million males in Mumbai. But the police distributed sketches anyway, based on this vague description. They conducted raids in nearby neighborhoods. They questioned hundreds of people. The investigation consumed thousands of man-hours and led precisely nowhere. Because the truth was becoming unavoidable, they were hunting a ghost, someone who left no trace, made no mistakes, and blended seamlessly back into Mumbai's teeming millions after each murder. The psychological toll on the city grew profound. Mumbai's homeless population, already marginalized and struggling, now lived in constant terror. Many stopped sleeping entirely, sustaining themselves on tea and cheap alcohol, pushing their bodies to the edge of collapse. Mental health crises spiked. So did alcohol and drug abuse, anything to numb the fear, to make sleep possible despite the danger. Social activists tried organizing shelter programs, attempting to get people off the streets entirely. But Mumbai's homelessness problem was systemic and massive. The shelters that existed were overcrowded, underfunded, and couldn't accommodate a fraction of those sleeping rough. The activists did what they could, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a thimble. April 1986 brought the 11th murder. Then the 12th. 12 confirmed victims. 12 people whose last moments were spent in what should be the safest state of human existence, sleep. 12 families somewhere who'd never know what happened. 12 lives reduced to police file numbers and newspaper statistics. And then, as suddenly as the nightmare began, it stopped. May, June, July passed without a Stoneman murder. The police remained vigilant, but the attacks had ceased. Had the killer moved to another city? Died? Been arrested for an unrelated crime? Simply stopped because the compulsion lifted? Nobody knew. The case remained technically open, but without new incidents, resources shifted to other priorities. The police patrols in homeless areas gradually scaled back. The media moved on to fresher horrors. Mumbai, always focused on survival and the next crisis, began forgetting. By late 1987, the Stoneman had largely faded from public consciousness. He'd become another unsolved mystery, another dark chapter in Mumbai's history. The homeless population remained wary, but even trauma fades with time and the human capacity for adaptation. The city exhaled. The nightmare was over, except it wasn't, not even close, because 400 kilometers away, in the city of Calcutta, someone was selecting victims. Someone was choosing rocks. Someone was preparing to teach another metropolis the meaning of terror. The Stoneman wasn't finished. He'd simply changed hunting grounds. Calcutta, 1989. The city gasped under the weight of its own humanity. A sprawling, suffocating urban jungle where poverty pressed so thick you could taste it in the humid air. Like Mumbai, Calcutta hosted tens of thousands sleeping rough on its pavements. Unlike Mumbai, Calcutta had no warning of what was coming. The first body appeared in June 1989, discovered near Howrah Station, one of the busiest railway terminals in India, a nexus where human beings flowed like blood through arteries. A homeless man, skull crushed by a heavy rock, killed while sleeping. The Calcutta police investigated it as an isolated incident. Gang violence, they assumed, or a personal dispute. They'd never heard of Mumbai's Stoneman. Why would they? This was before instant national news, before internet databases, before centralized crime tracking. The two cities existed in separate information bubbles, and criminal intelligence rarely flowed between them. The second murder came 2 weeks later. Different location, same method. Then a third, fourth, fifth. By August 1989, Calcutta's police realized they had a pattern. And someone, a retired Mumbai officer who'd relocated to Calcutta, or a journalist who'd covered the Mumbai killings, or perhaps just a detective with good instincts and better memory, made the connection. The Stoneman hadn't disappeared. He'd migrated. When this realization hit the media, the reaction was volcanic. The Mumbai killings, already fading into historical footnote, roared back into national consciousness. The Stoneman wasn't just a Mumbai problem. He was hunting across multiple cities. He was mobile, patient, and utterly unstoppable. The psychological impact on Calcutta's homeless population was immediate and devastating. News of Mumbai's 12 victims spread through the pavement communities like plague. They knew they were next. They knew the police hadn't caught him in Mumbai and likely wouldn't catch him here. They knew sleep had become a form of Russian roulette. Panic manifested in heartbreaking ways. Mothers with children sleeping on pavements began tying themselves together with rope, believing the killer wouldn't attack if the victim couldn't be isolated. Men fashioned crude weapons from scrap metal and broken glass, clutching them while trying to sleep, hoping they'd wake in time to defend themselves. Some people simply stopped sleeping on their backs, reasoning that if they slept on their stomachs or sides, they might see the attack coming. None of these defenses worked. The killer's method was too fast, too brutal. By the time a rock was falling toward a skull, consciousness and reaction time were irrelevant. Death came in a single blow. The Calcutta police, learning from Mumbai's failures, immediately organized a special task force. They studied the Mumbai case files, interviewed Mumbai detectives, and attempted to identify patterns in victim selection, timing, and location. They deployed officers across high-risk areas. They instituted a neighborhood watch program, recruiting volunteers to patrol streets at night. But Calcutta presented unique challenges. The city's street layout was more chaotic than Mumbai's, with narrow lanes and dead-end alleys offering perfect escape routes. The homeless population was more scattered, making protection even more difficult. And the killer seemed to have learned from his Mumbai experience. He was more cautious now, more selective, taking longer between kills to scout locations and plan approaches. August bled into September. The body count climbed. 7 victims. 8, 9. Each murder generated intensive media coverage, but the tone had shifted from sensationalistic horror to something grimmer: resignation. The press began framing the Stoneman as almost supernatural, an unstoppable force like disease or natural disaster. Headlines referred to him as a phantom and a shadow. The implication was clear. This killer couldn't be caught through normal police work. This narrative infuriated the Calcutta Police Commissioner, who publicly insisted they'd make an arrest soon. He couldn't back up this confidence with evidence or progress, but maintaining public faith required projecting certainty. Behind closed doors, the investigation was floundering. They had no physical evidence. The rocks used in Calcutta, like those in Mumbai, were common construction debris available anywhere. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA, which wasn't routinely analyzed in 1989 anyway. The killer never spoke to his victims, never took trophies, never sent messages. He simply appeared, killed, and vanished. Witness appeals yielded nothing useful. In a city of millions moving through the night, one man carrying a rock was invisible. Even when people noticed something suspicious, descriptions varied wildly. Young, old, tall, short, light-skinned, dark-skinned. The human mind, it turns out, is terrible at recording accurate details of unremarkable people doing unremarkable things. The closest the police came to a breakthrough happened in October 1989. An alert night watchman spotted a man loitering near a sleeping homeless person, behaving suspiciously. The watchman raised an alarm and the individual fled. Police found a heavy rock nearby, abandoned during the escape. The police flooded the area, cordoning off blocks, conducting house-to-house searches. They arrested 3 men matching vague descriptions of the fleeing suspect. Each was questioned extensively, their alibis checked, their backgrounds investigated. All 3 were eventually released. No evidence connected them to the murders. The investigation had struck gold and come up with fool's pyrite. That near miss seemed to spook the killer. The murders paused for 3 weeks, the longest gap in his Calcutta rampage. Police wondered if they'd scared him off permanently. Maybe he'd left Calcutta. Maybe he'd stopped entirely. November proved them wrong. 3 murders in 2 weeks, executed with the same brutal efficiency. The killer was back, and if anything, more confident than before. The victims in Calcutta differed slightly from Mumbai's. While most were adult men, the Calcutta murders included 2 women and 1 teenage boy. This shift troubled investigators. It suggested the killer's victim selection was broadening, or perhaps that his compulsion was intensifying, making him less discriminating. Social workers and activists tried desperately to help. They organized night shelters, though space was impossibly limited. They distributed blankets and encouraged people to sleep in groups, despite the strategy's proven ineffectiveness. They lobbied the government for increased resources, for systematic solutions to homelessness itself. Their efforts were admirable and utterly insufficient. The structural problems creating homelessness, poverty, lack of affordable housing, unemployment, mental illness couldn't be solved while a serial killer hunted. And the immediate problem of the killer couldn't be solved while thousands remained vulnerable on the streets every night. The wealthy areas of Calcutta remained largely insulated from direct fear, but the psychological contamination spread even there. Parents became paranoid about their children's safety. Home security boomed as people installed better locks, window bars, security systems. The city's collective psyche had been infected with the knowledge that monsters were real and walked among them. December 1989 brought the 13th Calcutta victim. Then silence. January 1990. Nothing. February, nothing. March, still nothing. The police maintained their vigilance, but resources were finite. Patrols gradually reduced. The media coverage tapered off. Life, as it always does, continued. By mid-1990, the Calcutta police officially acknowledged what Mumbai's police had learned years earlier. They had no leads, no suspects, and no reasonable expectation of catching the killer. The case remained open, but active investigation wound down. The Stoneman had struck 13 times in Calcutta, matching his Mumbai body count. 25 confirmed victims across 2 major cities. 25 murders executed with mechanical precision and absolutely zero mistakes. And then he vanished. Not moved to another city, vanished. No similar murders appeared anywhere else in India. No Stoneman-style killings in neighboring countries. The pattern simply terminated, like someone had flipped a switch. The sudden cessation generated as much speculation as the killings themselves. Was the killer dead? Imprisoned for an unrelated crime? Had he emigrated? Retired? Simply stopped because the compulsion burned itself out? The questions have never been answered. The Stoneman, whoever he was, disappeared as mysteriously as he'd appeared. The year 1991 arrived without a Stoneman murder. Then 1992. By 1993, most of India had moved on, the killings settling into the nation's vast catalog of unsolved crimes and unexplained horrors. But the case never truly closed. Couldn't close. Not with 25 victims and 0 suspects. Not with a killer who'd simply evaporated into the ether. The Stoneman murders became one of India's most notorious cold cases, a permanent question mark in the country's criminal history. For the families of the victims, those who even knew their relative had been murdered, there was no closure. Many victims were never identified, their bodies cremated or buried in paupers' graves. Their deaths documented only by police file numbers. Others had families who learned weeks or months later that their missing son, father, or brother had been found dead with a crushed skull on a Calcutta pavement. The psychological scarring extended far beyond direct victims. An entire generation of Mumbai and Calcutta's homeless population had learned to fear sleep itself. Even decades later, older individuals who'd survived the Stoneman era would speak of the terror, the nightly ritual of lying down on concrete, wondering if tonight would be their last night, if they'd wake to see dawn or feel nothing but a split second of explosive pain before oblivion. The police forces of both cities carried their own scars. The investigations had consumed thousands of man-hours, significant resources, and produced nothing. Officers who'd worked the cases spoke of the frustration, the helplessness of knowing another murder was probably happening right now, somewhere in their city, and being powerless to prevent it. Several theories about the killer's identity emerged over the years, each reflecting different assumptions about who would commit such crimes. The construction worker theory. Some investigators believed the killer was a construction or manual laborer. This would explain his comfort handling heavy rocks, his knowledge of where to find suitable stones, and his apparent physical strength. Construction workers also move between cities following jobs, which could explain the shift from Mumbai to Calcutta. But this theory, while plausible, described potentially thousands of men. The former homeless theory. Others suspected the killer had once been homeless himself, and the murders represented some twisted form of self-hatred or mercy killing. Perhaps he'd escaped street life and now saw death as a kindness compared to continued existence in poverty. This theory had psychological appeal but no supporting evidence. The mental illness theory. Many experts believe the killer suffered from severe mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia with violent delusions, or a personality disorder that eliminated empathy and inhibition. This would explain the compulsive nature of the crimes, the ritualistic method, and the sudden cessation, possibly due to institutionalization or death. But India's mental health system in the 1980s and 90s was rudimentary at best. Countless people with serious mental illness remained undiagnosed and untreated. The social cleansing theory. A darker possibility was that the killer viewed his actions as justified, eliminating undesirables from society. This mindset has historical precedent. Many serial killers target marginalized groups, prostitutes, homeless people, drug addicts, while rationalizing their murders as cleaning up society. If true, this would suggest someone with enough social awareness to identify vulnerable populations, but complete moral bankruptcy. The power killer theory. Some criminologists suggested the murders were purely about dominance and control. The killer selected the most powerless victims possible, people sleeping, defenseless, unable to fight back. This guaranteed success and minimized risk while providing maximum feelings of power. The gradual cessation of murders might indicate the killer had satisfied whatever internal need drove him, or found other outlets for his compulsions. None of these theories could be confirmed. The killer's motivations died with his anonymity. As the years passed, various individuals confessed to being the Stoneman. Police investigated each confession and found them all baseless, attention seekers, mentally ill individuals fixated on the case, or people trying to claim infamy. Real serial killers rarely confess without being caught. The fantasy of confession is usually just that, fantasy. The media periodically revisited the case, especially on anniversary dates. Documentaries were produced. Crime writers analyzed the murders. Internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries debated theories. The Stoneman entered India's cultural consciousness as a boogeyman figure, the killer who was never caught, who might still be out there, aging but not necessarily reformed. Some researchers tried connecting the Stoneman to other unsolved crimes. Were there similar murders elsewhere that went unreported or unconnected? India in the 1980s and 90s had limited centralized crime tracking. It's entirely possible similar killings occurred in smaller cities or rural areas without ever being linked to the Stoneman pattern. The true body count might exceed 25. Others investigated whether the killer might have been arrested or died from unrelated causes. They combed through prison records, death certificates, and criminal databases. The problem was scope. Without knowing who they were looking for, they were searching for a needle in a haystack the size of India. The forensic evidence from both cities still exists in storage, waiting for DNA technology that didn't exist in the 1980s. Several times over the years, investigators considered reopening the cases with modern techniques. But the rocks that were kept as evidence are unlikely to yield useful DNA. They've been handled by multiple people, stored improperly, and degraded over decades. The chances of extracting viable genetic material are minimal. The Stoneman murders forced changes in how Indian police handle serial crimes. The case demonstrated the dangers of information silos, Mumbai and Calcutta investigating separately, not sharing data, not recognizing a multi-city pattern. Modern Indian law enforcement has better interjurisdictional cooperation, computerized databases, and centralized crime analysis units partially because of lessons learned from this failure. The case also highlighted society's neglect of its most vulnerable. The Stoneman succeeded because he targeted people society had already marginalized. His victims were invisible in life and nearly remained invisible in death. The murders forced uncomfortable conversations about homelessness, poverty, and which lives society values enough to protect. But these systemic changes came too late for the 25 people who died with rocks crushing their skulls. Too late for the families who never got answers. Too late for a justice system that failed utterly to protect those who needed protection most. In Mumbai and Calcutta today, new generations sleep on the pavements. The specific terror of the Stoneman has faded, replaced by the general dangers of street life, exposure, disease, violence, poverty. But older residents remember. They tell stories of the monster who hunted sleepers, who killed without reason, who vanished like smoke. And sometimes, late at night when the city's finally quiet, when the endless noise dims to a background hum, people sleeping rough will jerk awake at unexplained sounds. A footstep, a shadow, a shape moving in peripheral vision. And for a moment, the terror returns, that primal fear of vulnerability, of being utterly defenseless while something monstrous approaches with murder in mind. The Stoneman may be gone, dead, imprisoned, or simply dormant, but the horror he created lingers. It lingers in the case files gathering dust. It lingers in the memories of those who lived through that era. It lingers in the unsolved mystery itself. The terrible knowledge that someone committed 25 perfect murders, terrorized 2 cities, and walked away without consequence. Serial killers are eventually caught or die. The FBI has detailed profiles on hundreds of them. True crime enthusiasts can recite their names, their methods, their psychological profiles. These killers are known quantities, horrible, yes, but understood, categorized, solved. The Stoneman isn't known. He remains a void where answers should be. And that void, that absence of resolution, might be the most disturbing element of all. Because somewhere, perhaps in India, perhaps elsewhere, perhaps no longer alive but perhaps still breathing, is a person who knows the truth. Someone who remembers selecting victims, lifting rocks, bringing them down on sleeping skulls. Someone who experienced whatever twisted satisfaction those murders provided. Someone who carries the memories of 25 last moments, 25 life lights extinguished by his hands. That person has never been held accountable, never faced justice, never been forced to answer for the terror inflicted on thousands and the lives stolen from 25. And we don't know his name. We don't know his face. We don't know anything except the evidence he left behind. Bodies, rocks, and fear. The Stoneman murders remain one of India's darkest mysteries. Not just because of what happened, but because we'll likely never know who made it happen. The case sits in that terrible category of crimes where the question mark is permanent, where closure is impossible, where the monster got away. Sleep is supposed to be safe. It's supposed to be the one state where we can completely let down our guard, trusting in basic human decency and social contracts. The Stoneman shattered that trust for an entire population. He proved that vulnerability can be lethal, that society's safety nets have gaps wide enough to fall through, that monsters are real and sometimes they win. That's the legacy of the Stoneman. Not just 25 murders, but the permanent scar on two cities' psyches. The knowledge that evil can operate in plain sight, kill repeatedly, and vanish without trace. The understanding that some questions never get answered, some murders never get solved, and some killers never face justice. The Stoneman walked away, and somewhere, that truth still echoes in the darkest corners of Mumbai and Calcutta. A whisper that asks the question that will never be answered. Who was he? If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Järvemp Butcher, Finland's most terrifying serial killer. Some monsters wear human faces so convincing, you'd invite them in for coffee and never walk out again. In the frozen heart of Finland, a predator learned that the best hiding place isn't in shadows. It's in plain sight, behind a smile. We thought we were tracking a killer, but what we found was something far worse. A chameleon who perfected the art of being invisible while standing right in front of you. Tonight, we descend into the nightmare that gripped Järvenpää, a quiet Finnish town where trust became a death sentence and a handshake could be your last. This is the story of Jari-Matti Tapani Sarasoja, the man who turned ordinary moments into hunting grounds, who weaponized kindness, and who proved that the most dangerous predators don't lurk in darkness. They thrive in daylight. Before we're done, you'll understand why some cases don't just haunt investigators. They rewrite the rulebook on evil itself. Järvenpää, Finland, a name that rolls off the tongue like a whisper, a municipality cradled just north of Helsinki, where lakes shimmer under midnight suns and winter nights stretch endlessly into oblivion. Population: roughly 40,000 souls living their unremarkable lives in unremarkable homes, working unremarkable jobs, raising unremarkable children. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where doors remain unlocked, where strangers are just neighbors you haven't met yet. The kind of place where horror shouldn't exist. But horror doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It doesn't wear a mask or carry a sign. Horror drives a regular car, shops at the same grocery store, smiles at the same cashier every Tuesday morning. Horror has a name, a job, a routine. Horror, in this case, was named Jari-Matti Tapani Sarasoja. The year was 2003, and something was wrong in Järvenpää. Not obviously wrong. Not the kind of wrong that makes headlines or sends police cars screaming through quiet streets. The kind of wrong that seeps into the foundation of a community like water through concrete, invisible until the structure begins to crack. People were vanishing. Not many. Not enough to cause panic. Just enough to create whispers. March brought the first disappearance. A man, middle-aged, the kind who drank too much and talked too loud, whose absence might be explained away by a bender, a trip, a sudden decision to start fresh somewhere else. His name was later discovered to be connected to Sarasoja's web, but at the time, he was just another face that stopped appearing at the local pub. Life continued. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and the town forgot. But memory is a stubborn thing, especially when it has cause to remember. Jari Sarasoja wasn't what you'd call remarkable. Born in 1966, He drifted through life with the kind of anonymity that makes people uncomfortable once they learn what you're capable of. Medium height, medium build, medium everything. Brown hair that was neither particularly thick nor thin. A face that cameras struggled to capture in any memorable way. Eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He worked odd jobs, construction here, manual labor there, the kind of work that keeps you moving, keeps you from forming attachments, keeps you forgettable. He was a drinker, not the falling down kind, not the kind that causes scenes. The quiet kind. The kind that uses alcohol as a social lubricant, that gravitates toward bars and pubs not for the drink itself, but for the ecosystem surrounding it. Because bars are perfect hunting grounds. They're filled with people whose judgment is impaired, whose guard is down, whose friends might not notice if they leave with someone new. They're filled with the lonely, the desperate, the ones looking for connection in all the wrong places. Sarasota understood this. He understood it the way a spider understands its web, the way a shark understands blood in water. He cultivated a persona, friendly but not overbearing, helpful but not suspiciously so, the kind of guy who'd offer you a ride home when you'd had one too many, who'd help you carry groceries, who'd lend you 20 euros without asking when you'd pay it back. The kind of guy who made you feel safe right up until the moment you realized you weren't. His apartment in Järvenpää was ordinary, Scandinavian functional, clean lines, minimal decoration. The kind of space that could belong to anyone, that revealed nothing about its occupant's interior life. Neighbors would later describe him as quiet, polite, the kind who kept to himself but always had a pleasant word when you passed in the hallway. They described the occasional sounds. Music playing late at night, footsteps, the mundane soundtrack of someone living alone. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was what those walls contained. What happened behind the door with the cheerful welcome mat. What transformations occurred in that space between the friendly neighbor stepping inside and the monster emerging hours, sometimes days, later. The pattern began to establish itself through the spring and summer of 2003, though it would only become clear in retrospect, the way constellations only make sense when you connect the dots with knowledge of what you're looking for. Men would meet Sarasota in bars, at bus stops, in casual encounters that seemed entirely innocent. They'd accept rides, invitations for drinks at his place, offers of help with various problems. They were usually struggling, financially, emotionally, socially. The vulnerable ones, the ones society had already begun to forget. And then they'd disappear. Not dramatically, not in ways that triggered immediate alarm. These weren't pillars of the community, weren't people with dozens of friends tracking their every move, weren't individuals whose absence created obvious voids. They were the peripheral ones, the ones whose disappearance might be noticed but not urgently investigated, not immediately treated as suspicious. They were, in Sarasota's calculated estimation, disposable. What happened in that apartment violated every definition of humanity. Sarasota wasn't just a killer, he was something more deliberate, more methodical. He was an experimenter, and his subjects were human beings rendered powerless through alcohol, drugs, or simple, overwhelming force. The details, when they finally emerged, would paint a portrait of sustained sadism, of someone who didn't simply want his victims dead but wanted to explore the limits of human suffering, to document the journey from person to corpse with scientific detachment. He photographed them, dozens of photographs, hundreds, capturing stages of decomposition, positions arranged with artistic pretension, close-ups of wounds and decay. He kept these images organized, cataloged, like a hobbyist documenting butterflies or stamps. Except his collection consisted of human beings in various states of death and degradation, men he'd stripped of everything, dignity, identity, life itself, and reduced to objects for his personal gallery. The apartment became a processing center. Bodies would remain there for extended periods, during which Sarasota would continue his life of mundane normalcy, going to work, chatting with neighbors, shopping for groceries. The dichotomy was staggering, the compartmentalization nearly perfect. During the day, he was nobody. At night, he was God and devil simultaneously, deciding who lived, who died, and how much they'd suffer in between. He developed routines for disposal. Finland's landscape, with its endless forests and deep lakes, provided ample opportunity for those willing to make the effort. Bodies wrapped in plastic, weighted with concrete, driven to remote locations under cover of darkness. Some were dismembered first, practical considerations about weight and discretion overriding any squeamishness about the act itself. Limbs separated from torsos, heads removed with the kind of crude efficiency that suggested practice, that suggested this wasn't the first, second, or even fifth time. But every predator makes mistakes. Every system, no matter how carefully constructed, has weaknesses. For Sarasota, that weakness was twofold: his need to document and his growing confidence. The photographs were evidence, tangible proof of crimes that might otherwise remain speculative. And confidence, that dangerous belief that he was smarter than everyone else, that he'd found the perfect formula, that he was untouchable, led to carelessness, led to patterns becoming recognizable, led to victims whose disappearances, when viewed collectively rather than individually, created a picture that demanded investigation. Summer faded into autumn, and the whispers in Jarvanpah grew louder. Families began comparing notes, noticing connections between missing persons cases that police had treated as separate, unrelated incidents. A man who'd been seen leaving a bar with someone matching Sarasoja's vague description. Another who'd told a friend he was going to help someone with construction work and never came home. Small details that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a pattern. A trail of breadcrumbs leading toward a truth nobody wanted to believe. Because accepting that truth meant accepting that evil had lived among them, had smiled at them in grocery store aisles, had shared their community while secretly destroying it from within. It meant acknowledging that their safe, predictable world was an illusion, that monsters were real, and that sometimes they looked exactly like everyone else. The investigation, when it finally began in earnest, would uncover depths of depravity that challenged even seasoned detectives' ability to process. But before we reach that chapter, before we examine how the mask finally slipped and the monster was revealed, we need to understand the landscape, both physical and psychological, that allowed Sarasota to operate for so long. Jarvanpah in 2003 was a community in transition, growing, modernizing, losing some of the tight-knit character that had defined it for generations. People were busier, more disconnected, less likely to notice when someone on the margins disappeared. The social safety net, once woven tight through personal relationships and community involvement, had developed holes. And Sarasota understood those holes intimately, navigated them with predatory precision, exploited them with chilling effectiveness. He was, in many ways, a killer perfectly suited to his era and environment. Not the dramatic serial killer of pulp fiction, not the theatrical psychopath leaving elaborate clues and taunting police. Just a quiet, methodical predator who understood human nature's darkest corners and used that understanding to fuel nightmares that would haunt Finland for years to come. The ghost in the machine was real, and he was just getting started. October 2003 brought the kind of cold that settles into your bones and refuses to leave, the kind that makes darkness fall like a hammer at 4 in the afternoon and doesn't lift until nearly noon the next day. In Jarvanpah, police investigators were experiencing a different kind of cold, the ice water realization that they were dealing with something unprecedented, something that violated every assumption about safety in their quiet corner of Finland. The breakthrough came not from brilliant detective work or cutting-edge forensics, but from something far more mundane, a landlord's complaint. Sarasoja's apartment building had been experiencing problems. Strange smells emanating from his unit, fluids seeping through the ceiling into the apartment below, complaints from neighbors about disturbing sounds at odd hours. The landlord, frustrated by Sarasoja's evasiveness and concerned about property damage, had contacted authorities about a possible sanitation issue. When police knocked on the door that October day, they expected nothing more dramatic than a hoarder's nest or perhaps evidence of a drug operation. What they found instead would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The apartment door opened to reveal what appeared, at first glance, to be a relatively normal living space. Furniture arranged conventionally, dishes in the sink, the ordinary detritus of everyday life. But the smell, that smell hit them immediately, a thick, cloying sweetness mixed with something far more sinister, the unmistakable odor of death and decay that no amount of air freshener or cleaning products could mask. What followed was a descent into hell meticulously documented. In the bedroom, investigators found the first body, a man, deceased for several days, positioned on the bed in what could only be described as a tableau. He'd been arranged, styled, photographed. Around the room, Polaroids covered nearly every surface, tacked to walls, spread across the dresser, scattered on the floor. Hundreds of images, each one a window into sustained horror. Victims in various states of undress and decomposition, close-ups of wounds and ligature marks, artistic shots that demonstrated a sick fascination with death as aesthetic experience. But it was what they found in the bathroom that truly revealed the scope of Sarasogia's activities. Human remains in various stages of dismemberment, stored in plastic containers and garbage bags with casual indifference. Body parts that had been there long enough to liquefy, creating the drainage problem that had triggered the landlord's complaint. Evidence of crude butchery performed without professional skill but with determined persistence. Hack marks on bones, incomplete separations, the mess of someone learning through practice. The forensic team worked through the night, documenting everything, photographing every surface, collecting evidence that would fill dozens of boxes and provide material for nightmares for years to come. With each new discovery, the full magnitude of what Sarasogia had been doing crystallized into horrifying clarity. This wasn't just murder. This was systematic predation elevated to ritual. This was someone who'd transformed his living space into an abattoir and gallery simultaneously, who'd lived alongside death so intimately that the boundaries between normal existence and monstrous behavior had completely dissolved. Sarasogia himself was arrested without incident at his workplace, a construction site where he'd been performing routine tasks with the same blank efficiency he brought to everything else. Co-workers would later express shock, though their memories of him were so vague, so nonspecific, that even their surprise felt muted. He was the human equivalent of beige, present but unmemorable, there but somehow absent. During initial questioning, Sarasogia maintained an eerie calm. He didn't deny the crimes. Denial would have been pointless given what police had discovered. Instead, he spoke about his victims with clinical detachment, referring to them by physical characteristics rather than names, discussing his actions with the emotional investment someone might bring to describing household repairs. There was no remorse, no justification, no attempt to explain or rationalize, just flat acknowledgement, as though he'd been caught doing something mildly embarrassing rather than something monstrous. The investigation expanded rapidly. Missing persons reports from across the Helsinki metropolitan area were re-examined. Families who'd given up hope of finding their loved ones suddenly found themselves contacted by police asking questions about social habits, frequented locations, last known whereabouts. The net widened, and with each new connection, the death toll climbed. Sarasogia had been active for at least 2 years, possibly longer. The confirmed victim count eventually reached 9, though investigators suspected the true number might be higher. Some victims had been completely dismembered and disposed of so thoroughly that only fragments remained. A finger recovered from a forest burial site, DNA extracted from stains in the apartment, enough to confirm death but not enough to recover a complete body. The victims shared certain characteristics that revealed Sarasogia's selection criteria. All were men, ranging in age from their late 20s to mid-50s. All struggled with addiction or social isolation. All were, in society's cruel calculus, considered low-priority missing persons, the kind whose disappearances merited investigation but not intensive resources, whose absence created sadness but not urgency. Sarasogia had identified and exploited this social vulnerability with predatory intelligence. He understood that society has tiers of victimhood, that some lives are considered more valuable than others, that you could target certain demographics with relative impunity because their deaths wouldn't trigger the same response as, say, a missing child or prominent citizen. He'd found a hunting ground in the margins, among the forgotten and discarded, and he'd harvested victims there with methodical efficiency. The psychological profile that emerged painted a portrait of profound emptiness. Sarasogia exhibited classic psychopathic traits: lack of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional connections, view of other humans as objects rather than beings with intrinsic worth. But beyond textbook psychopathy, there was something more disturbing: a complete absence of internal life. Interviews revealed no grand delusions, no hearing voices, No elaborate fantasy structures that sometimes characterize serial killers. Just emptiness, a void where human emotion should exist, filled instead with curiosity about death and a collector's instinct for documentation. His childhood, when investigators examined it, offered few obvious warning signs. Raised in a working-class family, unremarkable school performance, no documented abuse or trauma. He'd simply been quiet, withdrawn, the kid nobody really noticed or remembered. As an adult, he drifted through jobs and relationships, leaving no significant impression anywhere. It was as though he'd spent his entire life practicing invisibility, perfecting the art of being present without being seen. The trial preparations began amid intense media scrutiny. Finland, with its relatively low crime rate and generally peaceful society, wasn't accustomed to cases of this magnitude. The Jarvenpää murders became shorthand for a loss of innocence, for the shattering of assumptions about safety and community. How could this have happened? How could someone operate for so long without detection? What failures in the system, in social structures, in human awareness had allowed a predator to thrive for years? These questions had no satisfying answers. The truth was simultaneously simple and complex. Sarasoja succeeded because he understood human nature's blind spots, because he targeted victims society was prepared to overlook, because he maintained enough veneer of normalcy to avoid raising alarm bells, and because sometimes evil doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, patient and methodical, waiting for opportunity. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic analysis tied him to multiple crime scenes. The photographs alone constituted a visual confession, documenting crimes in explicit detail. Victim DNA saturated his apartment, present in quantities that no amount of cleaning could have eliminated. There was no question of guilt, no possibility of reasonable doubt. The trial, when it eventually proceeded, would be an exercise in documenting horror, in creating a legal record of atrocity, in attempting to impose societal judgment on actions that defied comprehension. But before that trial could begin, investigators faced the grim task of victim identification and family notification. Some victims had been so thoroughly dismembered and disposed of that identification required DNA matching, dental records, and painstaking reconstruction of fragmentary remains. Families who'd spent years wondering, hoping, fearing the worst, received confirmation that transformed anxiety into grief. Their loved ones weren't coming home. They'd encountered a monster, and that encounter had been fatal. The community of Jarvenpää struggled to process its transformation from quiet municipality to site of notorious crimes. Property values near Sarasoja's apartment building plummeted. Residents spoke in hushed tones about their unknowing proximity to evil, about passing the killer in hallways, about ordinary interactions that had occurred while, just meters away, unspeakable acts were taking place. The psychological impact rippled outward, creating waves of paranoia, mistrust, and existential unease. Who else might be hiding among them? What other ordinary faces concealed extraordinary darkness? The questions had no answers, but they fundamentally altered the town's character, introducing suspicion where trust had previously existed, creating wariness where openness had thrived. Sarasoja himself remained enigmatic throughout the investigation. He cooperated mechanically, providing information when directly asked but volunteering nothing. He showed no interest in understanding why he'd done what he'd done, no curiosity about his own psychology, no apparent awareness that his actions were exceptional rather than routine. It was as though he existed in a completely different moral universe, one where human suffering registered no more significantly than the suffering of insects or furniture. Psychiatrists who evaluated him struggled to classify what they were seeing. He met diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, certainly, but the sheer void at his core transcended standard classifications. This wasn't someone whose empathy had been damaged or suppressed. It was someone for whom empathy had never existed, for whom other humans were simply objects with varying utility and entertainment value. The investigation also revealed the systematic nature of his disposal methods. He'd scouted locations, prepared sites in advance, developed routines for transporting and concealing remains. This wasn't impulsive violence. This was planned, methodical murder with careful consideration given to avoiding detection. Each victim represented not just a death but a logistics operation, a problem to be solved through practical application of effort and planning. As autumn deepened into winter, the full scope of the Jarvanpah murders became clear. 9 confirmed victims, possibly more never to be identified. Years of predation, community violated. And at the center of it all, a man who seemed less like a person than like a whole, in reality shaped like a person. Someone whose fundamental nature was absence rather than presence. The monster had been caught, but understanding the monster, truly comprehending how such emptiness could exist, how such sustained cruelty could be committed without apparent motivation beyond curiosity, that remained elusive. Because some questions don't have answers that satisfy, some horrors don't have explanations that make sense, and sometimes the scariest truth is that evil doesn't need a reason. It simply needs opportunity. The Helsinki District Court, winter 2004. Snow fell outside with that peculiar Finnish silence, blanketing the city in white that seemed almost obscene given what was about to unfold inside the courthouse walls. This trial wasn't just about legal proceedings or establishing guilt. Guilt was never in question. This was about creating a record, about bearing witness, about attempting to impose human justice on acts that seemed to exist beyond human capacity. Yuri Sarasoja entered the courtroom looking exactly like what he was. Nobody. Standard issue prison clothing, handcuffs that seemed almost theatrical given his complete passivity. That same blank expression that had characterized every interaction since his arrest. He showed no fear, no anxiety, no recognition of the gravity of proceedings. Guards positioned around him seemed almost superfluous. He moved with mechanical compliance, sitting where directed, standing when instructed, participating in his own trial like someone attending a tedious administrative meeting. The prosecution's case was overwhelming to the point of redundancy. They presented it anyway, methodically, building a mountain of evidence that would have been sufficient to convict a dozen murderers. Forensic reports detailing DNA matches, establishing beyond any scientific doubt that Sarasoja's apartment had been a killing ground for multiple victims. Photographic evidence, carefully edited for court presentation but still devastating, showing victims in various stages of death and decomposition. The artistic pretension of Sarasoja's documentation making the images even more disturbing. Witness testimony painted a picture of systematic predation. Bar owners and bartenders recalled seeing Sarasoja with various men, always playing the friendly stranger, always offering rides or assistance, always departing with victims who would never be seen alive again. Co-workers described his absolute normalcy, his ability to show up for construction work mere hours after committing murder, his flat affect and emotional absence that nobody had found remarkable until context transformed it into something sinister. The pathologist's testimony was clinical, necessary, and devastating. He detailed injuries found on recovered remains, evidence of strangulation, blunt force trauma, ligature marks indicating prolonged restraint, post-mortem mutilation performed with household tools rather than surgical instruments. The brutality was compounded by its crude execution. This wasn't a skilled killer with medical knowledge, just someone willing to hack and saw through human flesh and bone with determined persistence. But it was victim impact statements that transformed the trial from legal proceeding into collective exorcism. Families of the dead took the stand, one after another, describing their loved ones not as the troubled, marginalized individual society had largely dismissed, but as human beings with histories, relationships, dreams that had been extinguished. Brothers who'd struggled with alcoholism but who'd called home every Sunday. Fathers who'd lost custody but who'd never stopped fighting to see their children. Men who'd fallen through society's cracks but who'd never stopped trying to climb back out. Sarasoja listened to none of it. Or perhaps he listened but processed it with the same empty regard he brought to everything else. His expression never changed. He took notes occasionally, but analysis of those notes revealed nothing meaningful. Random observations about courtroom architecture, doodles, fragments of thoughts that went nowhere. It was as though he was physically present but existentially absent, occupying space in the courtroom without actually being there in any meaningful sense. The defense, such as it was, attempted to argue diminished capacity. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about Sarasoja's profound personality disorders, about his complete lack of empathy, about psychological abnormalities that rendered him fundamentally different from neurotypical humans. The argument, essentially, was that someone so profoundly disconnected from normal human emotion couldn't be held to normal standards of responsibility. The prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation, planning, and awareness of consequences. Sarasoja had scouted disposal sites in advance. He'd targeted victims deliberately, selecting for vulnerability. He'd taken measures to avoid detection, cleaning crime scenes, timing activities to minimize witness exposure. Someone incapable of understanding his actions couldn't have executed such methodical planning. The psychiatric abnormalities didn't erase responsibility, they explained methodology. As the trial progressed through weeks that felt like months, a portrait emerged of sustained horror almost beyond comprehension. The photographs alone numbered in the hundreds, a systematic documentation project that revealed Sarasoja's view of murder as something approaching art. He'd experimented with composition, lighting, angles. He'd arranged bodies in poses that suggested theatrical direction. He'd returned to decomposing corpses repeatedly to photograph progressive stages of decay, treating death as a time-lapse project. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of sustained exposure to death. Forensic examiners described nightmares, intrusive thoughts, the trauma of processing crime scenes where human remains had been treated with such callous indifference. Even hardened professionals, people who'd built careers around confronting violence and death, found themselves struggling with what Sarasoja's apartment had contained. One particularly devastating testimony came from a neighbor, an elderly woman who'd lived in the apartment below Sarasoja's for 3 years. She described hearing sounds, dragging, thumping, occasional screams that she'd dismissed as television or arguments. She described the fluids that had seeped through her ceiling, creating stains she'd blamed on plumbing issues, stains that forensic analysis later revealed were human decomposition fluids. She'd lived directly beneath a charnel house, had complained to the landlord about unpleasant odors, had existed mere meters from ongoing atrocities, separated by nothing but a thin layer of flooring. Her guilt was palpable, though entirely undeserved. How could she have known? How could anyone have known? Sarasoja's normalcy was his most effective weapon, the mundane exterior that deflected suspicion, that transformed monstrous actions into background noise easily dismissed or rationalized away. The trial also explored Sarasoja's method of victim selection in detail. He'd frequented specific bars known for clientele struggling with addiction and social problems. He'd identified men experiencing acute crises, recent job losses, relationship failures, financial difficulties. He'd offered assistance that seemed genuine, that tapped into basic human desire for connection and help. And once victims were isolated, once they were in his apartment, once they were vulnerable through alcohol or drugs or simple trust, he'd acted. Several victims had been plied with substances, excessive alcohol, sedatives when available, that reduced their ability to resist. Toxicology reports from the bodies recovered in states allowing such analysis revealed cocktails that would have rendered victims compliant, confused, incapable of fighting back effectively. Sarasoja had understood that physical force wasn't necessary when chemistry could accomplish the same goal with less risk and effort. The timeline established by prosecutors revealed an escalating pattern. Early victims were killed relatively quickly, with less elaborate post-mortem activity. But as Sarasoja grew more confident, more comfortable with his activities, the torture extended, the photography became more elaborate, the disposal methods more casual. By the time of his arrest, he'd been keeping bodies in his apartment for days or even weeks, living alongside decomposing remains with apparent indifference, continuing his normal routines while surrounded by death. Psychologists testified about possible motivations, though all acknowledged the speculative nature of their analysis. Serial killers typically fall into categories: mission-oriented killers targeting specific groups, visionary killers responding to hallucinations or delusions, hedonistic killers seeking pleasure, power and control killers asserting dominance. Sarasoja didn't fit cleanly into any category. His motivations seemed to be a mixture of curiosity, control, and something approaching boredom relief. He killed because he was interested in killing, because victims were available, because he could. The prosecution called it what it was: Evil. Not evil as theological concept, but evil as practical description of actions so divorced from human empathy, so fundamentally destructive, so sustained and deliberate that no other word sufficed. These weren't crimes of passion, weren't reactions to provocation, weren't even driven by comprehensible desires like greed or revenge. They were expressions of absolute disregard for human life, manifestations of someone who viewed other people as objects for personal entertainment. Throughout all of this, Sarasota maintained his unsettling calm. He never testified in his own defense, exercising his right to silence with the same mechanical compliance he brought to everything else. The few statements he'd made to investigators were read into the record. Flat acknowledgments of facts, emotionless recitations of events, no attempts at justification or explanation. Just information delivered with the enthusiasm someone might bring to reading a phone book. The defense's closing arguments were perfunctory. They couldn't dispute facts, couldn't challenge evidence, couldn't present alternative narratives. They could only argue for mitigation based on mental abnormality, for recognition that Sarasota was profoundly damaged in ways that reduced culpability. It was a legal obligation discharged without conviction, advocacy performed because the system required it but that everyone recognized as essentially meaningless. The prosecution's closing painted a picture of systematic predation, of a functional psychopath who'd exploited society's indifference to marginalized individuals, who'd operated in plain sight because he understood human nature's blind spots, who'd transformed his living space into an abattoir because he could. They asked for maximum penalties under Finnish law, for acknowledgement that some crimes are so egregious that mercy becomes obscene. The judges, 3 professionals and 4 lay judges, as was standard in Finnish serious criminal cases, deliberated for 2 days. It wasn't about establishing guilt. Guilt was established beyond any conceivable doubt. It was about determining appropriate sentencing within a legal framework that didn't have a clear precedent for this magnitude of horror. Finland had no death penalty, no life without parole. The maximum sentence was life imprisonment, but even that came with possibility of parole consideration after 12 years. How do you sentence someone like Sarasota? How do you impose adequate justice for 9 confirmed murders, for systematic torture, for years of predation, for actions that seem to violate basic humanity? The legal system wasn't designed for true monsters. It was designed for humans who transgressed, who could theoretically be rehabilitated, who existed within the normal spectrum of criminal behavior. Sarasota existed somewhere else entirely. When the verdict came, it surprised no one. Guilty on all counts, multiple life sentences to be served consecutively. The judge's statement was unusually detailed, explicitly noting the exceptional nature of the crimes, the lack of any mitigating circumstances, the need to protect society from someone fundamentally incapable of coexisting with other humans. They recommended that Sarasota never be released, though that recommendation carried no legal weight. Future parole boards would make their own assessments. Sarasota received the verdict with the same blank expression he'd maintained throughout the trial. No reaction, no emotion, just acknowledgement, as though he'd been informed of a weather forecast or train schedule. Guards led him away, back to prison, where he'd spend the remainder of his life in isolation necessary to protect both him and other inmates from the violence his presence might trigger. The courtroom emptied slowly. Families of victims emerged into winter darkness, seeking whatever closure formal justice could provide, finding it insufficient but necessary. Media congregated outside, broadcasting headlines that would dominate Finnish news for days. And somewhere in the background, Jarvenpää tried to move forward, tried to return to normalcy, tried to forget that for years, a monster had walked among them. But some things can't be forgotten. Some stains don't wash out, and some truths, once learned, fundamentally alter reality. Vanta Prison, 2005 and beyond. Finland's maximum security facility, where the nation's most dangerous criminals spend their lives in controlled isolation, removed from society but paradoxically protected by that same society's commitment to human dignity. Cell Block C, Wing 3, Maximum Security Psychiatric Unit. This is where Jari Sarasota would spend the rest of his existence, in a space measuring roughly 12 square meters, with reinforced walls and a window that offered a rectangle of sky but nothing more. Prison records describe an inmate who caused no trouble, who followed rules with mechanical precision, who existed in his cell like furniture, present but inert. He maintained minimal hygiene, ate when food was provided, slept when lights were dimmed, spent his waking hours in activities that revealed nothing about his interior life. He read occasionally, usually technical manuals or history books, processing information with the same flat effect he brought to everything. He watched television, favoring documentaries over fiction, news over entertainment, as though he was studying the world rather than participating in it. Psychological evaluations continued periodically, though they revealed little beyond what was already known. Sarasoja remained fundamentally disconnected from normal human emotion. He understood intellectually that his actions were considered wrong. He could articulate societal rules and legal standards, but that understanding was academic rather than internalized. He showed no growth, no development, no evolution of consciousness. He was, in the professional opinion of multiple psychiatrists, exactly what he appeared to be: a void in human form, someone whose inner life was characterized by absence rather than presence. But the story of the Jarvanpah killer extends far beyond the man himself. It radiates outward, creating ripples that continue to disturb Finland's social waters years after his arrest. The case became a watershed moment, forcing uncomfortable conversations about social safety nets, about how society treats its most vulnerable members, about the systems that failed to notice when men were disappearing from the margins. In Jarvanpah, the transformation was profound and permanent. The apartment building where Sarasoja had lived was eventually demolished. No amount of cleaning or renovation could eliminate the psychic stain of what had occurred there. The land sat empty for years before finally being redeveloped, the new construction deliberately designed to look nothing like what had existed before. But locals still avoid the area, still speak in hushed tones about the ground itself being cursed, contaminated by atrocity. The victims' families formed a support group, united by shared trauma and the particular grief of losing loved ones to senseless violence. They fought for recognition that their family members, despite their struggles and social marginalization, deserved to be remembered as humans rather than statistics. They advocated for policy changes, for increased resources devoted to tracking missing persons regardless of their social status, for acknowledgement that vulnerability shouldn't equal invisibility. Some achieved measure of peace, others never did. The mother of one victim, a man who'd struggled with alcoholism but who'd been working toward sobriety when Sarasoja targeted him, became an advocate for addiction treatment programs. Her reasoning was straightforward and devastating. If society had better supported her son's recovery, if he'd had access to more comprehensive treatment, maybe he wouldn't have been in that bar on that particular night, wouldn't have been vulnerable to a predator's overtures of false friendship, wouldn't have accepted that fatal ride. Another family member, the sister of a victim who'd been homeless on and off for years before his death, dedicated herself to working with unsheltered populations. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, appeared on television programs, always carrying the same message. These were people, not problems. They had names, histories, families who loved them. Their deaths should have mattered as much as anyone else's, should have triggered immediate investigation, should have prevented subsequent murders. The fact that they didn't revealed something rotten in society's value system. The police department underwent significant restructuring in the wake of the case. Internal reviews identified multiple points where connections between missing persons cases could have been made earlier, where patterns might have been recognized if resources had been allocated differently, if different priorities had guided investigation decisions. New protocols were implemented, cross-referencing systems for missing persons reports, dedicated task forces for cases involving vulnerable populations, training programs focused on recognizing serial predation patterns. But these changes, while necessary, felt like closing the barn door after the horses had escaped. 9 men were dead, possibly more whose disappearances were never connected to Sarasoja, whose remains were never recovered, whose families still wonder. No amount of policy reform could resurrect them, could give back the years they didn't get to live, could undo the terror of their final hours. The media fascination with the case followed predictable patterns but with peculiarly Finnish characteristics. Unlike American serial killer coverage, which often veers into sensationalism or near glorification, Finnish reporting maintained a grimmer, more reserved tone. Sarasoja was never mythologized. never given a dramatic nickname beyond the clinical Jarvanpa serial killer. Coverage focused on victims and systemic failures rather than killer psychology. There was a collective determination not to give Sarasoja the attention he might have craved, not to transform him into anything more than what he was, a predator who'd exploited human vulnerability. Academic interest, however, was intense. Criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists examined the case from multiple angles. How had Sarasoja avoided detection for so long? What did his methodology reveal about gaps in social services and law enforcement? What could his victim selection criteria teach about societal marginalization? The case became material for dissertations, conference presentations, textbooks. Not celebrated, but studied, dissected with clinical detachment in hopes of understanding and preventing similar horrors. International true crime communities discovered the case as well, though language barriers limited detailed coverage outside Scandinavia. The photographs that Sarasoja had taken, those that weren't sealed as evidence, were discussed in academic contexts but never publicly released. Finnish authorities maintained strict control over the most graphic materials, understanding that some documentation of atrocity serves no purpose beyond satisfying morbid curiosity, that victim dignity demands certain images never enter public consciousness. Prison staff who interacted with Sarasoja regularly reported an unsettling experience. He wasn't violent, wasn't aggressive, wasn't even particularly unpleasant. He was simply there, occupying space without truly inhabiting it. Guards described feeling watched by him, not in a threatening way, but with a kind of empty observation, like being studied by a camera or scientific instrument. He seemed curious about normal human interaction in the way an anthropologist might be curious about an unfamiliar culture, observing without understanding, noting without comprehending. One psychologist who evaluated Sarasoja annually described him as the most profoundly disconnected individual I've encountered in 3 decades of practice. She elaborated, "He can describe human emotions the way someone might describe colors they've never seen, intellectually aware of the concept but fundamentally unable to experience it. When I ask him about remorse, he understands I expect him to feel something, but he genuinely doesn't. It's not suppression or denial, it's absence. The wiring simply isn't there." This absence manifested in disturbing ways during prison psychological sessions. When asked about his victims, Sarasoja would refer to them by physical characteristics or circumstances of their deaths rather than names, even when reminded of their identities. The one from the bar near the train station, or the one who took 3 days, not dehumanizing deliberately, but revealing that he'd never humanized them to begin with. They'd been projects, experiments, curiosities, never people. He showed no interest in understanding why he'd done what he'd done. Self-reflection seemed not just difficult but irrelevant to him. Multiple therapists attempted to engage him in exploring his psychology, his motivations, his inner experience. He participated cooperatively but without investment, answering questions with flat honesty but never volunteering insights, never demonstrating curiosity about his own nature. It was as though the person least interested in understanding Jari Sarasoja was Jari Sarasoja himself. The question of parole, though practically unlikely, haunted discussions about the case. Finnish law didn't allow for true life imprisonment without possibility of parole consideration. After serving 12 years, even Sarasoja could theoretically apply for release, could be evaluated by boards tasked with determining rehabilitation potential and public safety risk. The thought terrified communities, terrified victim families, terrified anyone who'd examined the case closely. Prison psychiatrists filed repeated reports explicitly stating their professional opinion. Sarasoja would never be safe for release. He hadn't been rehabilitated because rehabilitation implies changing from one state to another, and Sarasoja had never possessed the empathy or moral framework that rehabilitation might restore. You can't rehabilitate someone to a state they never occupied. You can't teach empathy to someone whose neurological architecture simply doesn't support it. The risk he posed in 2003 remained unchanged years later, would remain unchanged decades later, would persist until death. Yet the possibility hung there, a distant but real threat, a reminder that justice systems built for humans sometimes struggle with those who exist beyond human parameters. The broader cultural impact of the case manifested in unexpected ways. Finland's traditionally high social trust, the tendency to assume good faith in strangers, to help without suspicion, to maintain relatively open social norms, experienced measurable decline in regions around Helsinki. Surveys showed increased wariness about accepting rides from acquaintances, about inviting casual friends to homes, about drinking with people met in bars. The paranoia wasn't universal or permanent, but it represented a loss of innocence, an acknowledgement that monsters can wear friendly faces. True crime became more popular in Finnish media after the Sarasoja case. Podcasts, documentary series, books examining both historical and contemporary crimes found growing audiences. There was hunger for understanding, for patterns that might provide warning signs, for knowledge that might protect against predation. But Finnish coverage remained characteristically reserved, focusing on victimology and systemic analysis rather than killer glorification. Educational institutions incorporated the case into training programs. Police academies used it as a case study in pattern recognition and interagency cooperation. Social work programs examined it through the lens of vulnerable population protection. Medical schools included it in psychiatric training, using Sarasoja as an example of profound personality disorder manifestation. The case became teaching material, a dark lesson purchased at terrible cost. Victim memorials emerged gradually. In Jarvenpää, a small park was created with plaques bearing the names of confirmed victims, men whose lives had been reduced to footnotes in a killer's story, now formally remembered as individuals. Annual services brought together families, survivors, community members committed to ensuring that the dead weren't forgotten, that their value as humans wasn't erased by the circumstances of their deaths. These memorials served another function, creating space for the living to process collective trauma. Communities need rituals for confronting horror, for acknowledging what occurred, for asserting continued existence despite that knowledge. The services weren't about Sarasoja, they were about reclaiming narrative, about insisting that the story of Jarvenpää was larger than one man's atrocities, that community identity couldn't be permanently defined by its worst moment. Research into serial killer psychology intensified, with Sarasoja representing a particular subtype, the invisible predator. Not the dramatic, attention-seeking killer of media mythology, but the methodical, emotionally void individual who operates through careful exploitation of social blind spots. Studies examined how to identify such individuals earlier, what warning signs might exist, whether intervention was possible before violence manifested. The answer, frustratingly, was that early identification remained extraordinarily difficult. Sarasoja's childhood and young adulthood showed minimal warning signs. He'd been withdrawn, yes, but not violently so. Antisocial, but within normal ranges for troubled youth. Nothing screamed future serial killer, because that's not how most serial killers develop. They emerge from circumstances sometimes indistinguishable from those that produce ordinary, functional adults. The factors that tip someone into predatory violence remain frustratingly opaque. As years passed, media coverage of Sarasoja declined. New cases emerged, demanded attention, faded in turn. The cycle of outrage and fascination moved on, leaving the Jarvenpää case as historical reference rather than current crisis. But for those directly affected, families, investigators, community members, time's passage brought no closure, only distance from acute pain that never fully healed. Sarasoja himself aged in prison, though descriptions suggested the passage of time marked him minimally. He'd always looked older than his years, possessed that timeless quality of profound emotional exhaustion or emptiness. Prison medical reports noted standard aging-related health issues, declining vision, joint problems, the ordinary decay of a body moving through decades, but nothing remarkable. He persisted, a biological organism maintaining function while housing something that defied categorization. Some who studied the case closely came to view Sarasoja as almost tragically representative of something fundamental about human nature's dark potential. Not an aberration, not an exception, but an extreme expression of capacities that exist along a spectrum, the ability to view others as objects, the capacity for violence, the potential for profound disconnection from empathy. Most humans possess these capacities in dormant or controlled forms. In Sarasoja, they existed unmoderated, unchecked, defining his entire being. This perspective offered no comfort. If anything, it was more disturbing than viewing him as an inexplicable monster. Because if Sarasota represented an extreme along a spectrum rather than something entirely separate from humanity, it suggested that the distance between normal and monstrous might be smaller than anyone wanted to believe, that given different circumstances, different neurological configurations, different social contexts, the capacity for such horror might lurk in unexpected places. The final element of Sarasota's legacy was silence. He stopped granting interviews years ago, stopped even the minimal communication with evaluators beyond what was legally required. He withdrew into himself, or perhaps more accurately, withdrew into the void that had always been his essential nature. Prison staff reported he could go days without speaking, existing in his cell like a statue, animated only when necessary for routine maintenance of biological function. This silence felt appropriate somehow, a monster refusing mythologization, declining to provide the explanations or insights that might transform horror into narrative. No dramatic pronouncements, no philosophical musings, no attempts at justification or understanding. Just emptiness, prolonged across decades, a void in human form serving a life sentence that would end only with death. And when death eventually comes for Yari Sarasota, whether from natural causes, illness, the simple wearing down of biological systems, what will remain? 9 confirmed victims whose lives were stolen, whose deaths were documented with obscene precision, whose families still grieve. A community permanently marked by proximity to evil. A case file thick with evidence of humanity's darkest possibilities. And a question that will never have a satisfying answer. How does something like this exist? The truth is simple and terrifying. We don't know. We can catalog symptoms, document behaviors, create profiles and analyses. But the fundamental mystery, how someone can be so profoundly disconnected from everything that defines human consciousness, remains unsolved. Sarasota is proof that such disconnection is possible, that monsters are real, that they don't always announce themselves with thunder and horror, but sometimes simply exist quietly among us until circumstances reveal what they truly are. The Jarvanpah serial killer's story doesn't end with his capture or conviction or imprisonment. It continues in the lives permanently altered by his actions, in the policies reformed in response to his crimes, in the collective memory of a community that learned terrible lessons about trust and vulnerability and evil's mundane face. It continues in the ongoing work to protect those society too often overlooks, to recognize that marginalization creates hunting grounds for predators, that our most vulnerable deserve the same protection, investigation, and justice as anyone else. And it continues in the dark corners of human consciousness, in the acknowledgement that sometimes there are no satisfying answers, no clear explanations, no redemptive narratives. Sometimes there is only horror, sustained and documented and ultimately incomprehensible, a reminder that the world contains depths of darkness we can barely fathom, embodied in the empty eyes of men who look human but lack whatever spark makes us truly alive. Jarvanpah recovered, mostly. Life continues. Children play in parks, families gather for meals. The ordinary rhythms of existence persist. But something changed permanently. Some threshold was crossed. Some innocence was lost that can never be recovered. And on cold winter nights, when darkness falls early and snow muffles the world into silence, people lock their doors a little more carefully, look at strangers with slightly more suspicion, and remember that monsters are real. They always have been. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.